The story of Dutch Van Der Linde is not just the tale of a villain unraveling. It is a story of how a man worshipped as a father, a teacher, almost a prophet, becomes the cold stranger standing over Arthur Morgan on a bleak, rain-soaked mountainside. Between those two images lies an entire world of freedom and philosophy, of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams that begin as ideals and end as delusions. At the very beginning, Dutch is not the broken figure of Guarma or Beaver Hollow. He is the living embodiment of the Van der Linde dream, an idealistic outlaw who speaks of justice and freedom as if they are sacred words, who builds a family out of lost souls and misfits, and promises them a better way to live. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch refuses to simply bow his head to civilization and its railroads, banks, and Pinkertons. He offers something different, or so it seems. This is the space this story will inhabit, the years before the Blackwater disaster, before the ferry, before the gang is reduced to hunted animals in the trees. From Dutch's formative youth in the ashes of the Civil War, scarred by a father who died fighting for the Union, through the 1870s and 1880s as he and Hosea Matthews drift across a restless America, conning the powerful and charming the desperate. From its humble beginnings as two rival swindlers trying to rob each other in a hotel room, the Van der Linde gang grows into a roaming community that believes it can outrun history itself. Across these decades, every key relationship, every piece of the early code, every small victory and quiet compromise will matter. Dutch and Hosea refining a philosophy that claims to rob from the rich and spare the innocent. A young Arthur Morgan, taken in as a boy, taught to read, to think, to believe he is more than a common criminal. John Marston arriving later, another stray folded into the same rough embrace. These bonds turn crime into a cause, turn an outlaw campfire into, in the truest sense, a family. Yet even in these golden years, the cracks are already there. Dutch's hatred of government hardens into obsession. His rhetoric about freedom grows grander as his methods grow harsher. The feud with Colm O'Driscoll, the murder of Dutch's lover Annabelle, the first times a job meant to avoid bloodshed ends with bodies in the mud. Each moment bends the dream a little further away from what it claimed to be. This video will trace the entire lore of that early Van der Linde dream, from camp to camp, scheme to scheme, from quiet fireside lessons to the first betrayals of Dutch's own code. It will follow him up to the edge of Blackwater and then stop, right before the world knows him only as a madman and a monster. Because before that final fall, a question hangs over every story told about him. Was Dutch Van der Linde ever truly the good man Arthur believed in? Or was that goodness always a beautiful lie he told himself and everyone around him from the very beginning? So this will not be a collection of scattered anecdotes or half-remembered campfire tales. This will be a complete, chronological narrative of the man Dutch Van der Linde was before Blackwater, from its humble beginnings in backroom cons with Hosea Matthews to those last quiet days when his ideals still felt real, before the world only saw a madman on a ferry dock. It will follow the gang's story from the very beginning, but the focus will stay fixed on Dutch as a man, his philosophy, his charm, his contradictions. The lens for that will be his relationships, because Dutch does not exist in a vacuum. Through Hosea, the equal and friend who could talk him down. Through Arthur, the devoted son who believed in him in the truest sense. Through John, the rebellious heir who never fully fit the mold. Through the early gang, those misfits who saw in Dutch the living embodiment of freedom and family when civilization offered them nothing. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of an outlaw trying to build a home in a world that had already decided his kind was obsolete. Each bond around Dutch will reveal another angle of his character. The teacher who put a book in Arthur's hands, the partner who planned bloodless scams with Hosea, the father who dragged John out of a noose rather than leave him to hang. Every act of kindness will sit beside a quieter, sharper edge that hints at the man he will become. To hold that complexity, the story will unfold in clear stages. First, the origin of the gang, Dutch and Hosea as rival conmen, two lost souls who meet trying to rob each other and end up building something bigger than either imagined. Then, the ideological foundation, Dutch's hatred of government born from a Union father who died in a war that promised freedom and delivered graves. His belief that the world was changing and that the old ways were dying under railroads, banks, and barbed wire. From there, The recruitment of Arthur and John will show how Dutch tried to raise outlaws as philosophers, not just gun hands. The so-called golden years will follow. Early train jobs aimed at the rich, rescues where Dutch risks himself for his people, camps where laughter, music, and Dutch's speeches make their criminal life feel almost noble. But alongside that, the slow rot of his morality will begin. Small compromises, growing pride, an insistence that his code is never wrong, even when blood proves otherwise. All of this will be stitched together from both Red Dead Redemption games, pulling lesser-known lore, off-screen history, and implied backstory into one coherent, cinematic saga. The goal is not just to recount events, but to make sense of them. How does the man rescuing John from the gallows become the man leaving him on a rooftop? To answer that, the narrative will start not with a gunfight or a robbery, but with a young Dutch in the shadow of the Civil War, shaped by loss, by grief, and by the lies America told itself about honor and progress. That is where the dream begins, and where the first crack is already forming. For Dutch, that dream begins with a grave and a uniform. His father went off to fight for the Union in the Civil War, believing in a cause greater than himself, and never came home. What did the nation give back for that loyalty? A folded flag, a few official words, and a boy who learned early that governments speak of honor while feeding men into the fire. In the 1870s, Dutch grew up in the long shadow of that dead war, a son of a promise already broken. The world was changing, but not in the way the speeches had claimed. Railroads carved through valleys his father had ridden through on horseback. Telegraph wires stitched the sky. Corporations rose in the east, buying land, buying lawmen, buying politicians, while maimed veterans begged on corners and widows took in laundry to survive. From its humble beginnings, this was a story of progress for some and abandonment for others. To a sharp, angry boy watching this, the message was clear. The old ways were dying, but not because they had failed. They were being strangled. Freedom, he decided, was not defended by flags or parades, but by those willing to stand outside the institutions that wasted human lives without remorse. Every train that thundered past, every company man barking orders at laborers, every official who stepped over a drunk veteran in the street hardened that belief. Yet Dutch was not raised only on bitterness. He found books, often secondhand, sometimes stolen, and devoured them. Newspapers, political pamphlets, speeches reprinted from distant cities, these became his real teachers. He read about revolution and philosophy, about republics born in blood and empires rotting from within. In the truest sense, he began to see the American frontier as a battlefield of ideas, not just guns. If the men who ran civilization were corrupt, then surely a better mind could do better. That belief was his first real wound and his first real weapon. Dutch came to see himself as more than a common man, as if the same fate that took his father had chosen him for something greater. It fed his charisma. He could stand in a saloon or by a campfire and turn his private anger into a shared language of freedom and dignity. But it also fed his ego. Who else, he thought, truly understood what was happening to the world? Here, at the very beginning, the contradiction took root. Dutch spoke of the common man, of family, of giving the lost soul a place to belong. Yet he already imagined himself as the living embodiment of resistance, the one enlightened mind meant to lead. It was a philosophy born from grief and sharpened by pride, struggling between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization. All it needed now was another mind to challenge it, to refine it, to share the burden of the dream. That moment would come on a dusty road, with a stranger whose hand reached for the same purse, and whose smile carried the same dangerous conviction. Hosea Matthews. It began not with gunfire, but with a misunderstanding. Not with a standoff in the dust, but with two hands reaching for the same easy mark on a sunburnt afternoon. The road was quiet, a stretch of beaten earth outside a small-town inn where the paint peeled and the promises were cheap. Travelers came through chasing freedom or running from civilization, and that made it fertile ground for men who lived between those worlds. Dutch Van Der Linde was there first, watching a portly merchant fuss with his coin purse, rehearsing the speech he would give about corruption, about the rich bleeding the poor, even as his own fingers itched for the man's wallet. Across the way, Hosea Matthews watched the same merchant with the same intent. He had his own story prepared, a tale of a lost soul in need of help. a little performance to loosen the strings of a heavy purse. To him, this was a story of survival and wit, not violence. He preferred a smile and a lie over a bullet and a grave. Dutch moved in with practiced charm, brushing the merchant's shoulder, distracting him with a complaint about railroad men and government taxes. Hosea moved in from the other side, tripping gracefully, colliding with Dutch, apologizing as his hand went for the purse at the exact moment Dutch's did. For a heartbeat, both men froze, each feeling another thief's fingers where only their own should have been. The tension could have snapped into bloodshed. Two ambitious outlaws, one mark, one mistake. In another story, this is where guns clear leather and the dust runs red. Instead, their eyes met, and realization dawned. They had both been working the same con on the same man at the same time. The merchant sputtered and fled, clutching his money, leaving the real danger standing face to face, empty-handed. Dutch's jaw tightened, then eased. Hosea's shoulders shook once, then twice, and the first sound that broke the silence was not a threat, but a laugh. It caught Dutch off guard. Then he laughed too. In that laughter there was recognition. Wit answering wit. Charm meeting charm. A shared disdain for authority, for the small, mean rules of a world that claimed to be civilized while grinding people into dust. Both men preferred cleverness over bloodshed, theater over slaughter. From its humble beginnings, their partnership was in the truest sense a meeting of philosophies as much as of talents. They talked until the shadows grew long, trading stories of bad preachers, crooked sheriffs, and railroad men who thought progress meant ownership. Dutch spoke of the old ways were dying, of a world closing in. Hosea spoke of opportunity in the cracks of that changing world, of cons that could hurt the powerful more than any bullet. Each challenged the other, refined the other, tested where idealistic dreams ended and workable plans began. The turning point was simple. Dutch reached for his revolver, then stopped, hand hovering, and let it fall away from the grip. Hosea watched, smiled, and extended a hand instead. Work against each other and both starve. Work together and the whole West becomes a stage. That handshake was the very beginning of the Van Der Linde gang, long before the name existed. In that moment, the gang's tone was set. More con artists and dreamers than cold-blooded killers, at least at first. Two equal partners in crime and philosophy, building a family out of misfits and possibility. A story of loyalty and rebellion, born not in a hail of bullets, but in shared laughter on a dusty road. The world was changing, and so were they. The next step would be turning that chance meeting into a roaming camp. A living embodiment of Dutch's promise. A place where those cast aside by civilization could belong, even as the seeds of future betrayal quietly took root. From that chance meeting on the road, the partnership hardened in motion. Town to town, rail stop to rail stop. Dutch and Hosea began to test what their shared dream of freedom actually meant when money was tight, tempers were short, and civilization pressed in from every direction. Their early work was almost elegant. No dynamite, no massacres, no bodies left in the dust. One week, they were respectable businessmen from the East, selling shares in a railroad spur that would never be built. Another, they were land speculators promising access to oil that did not exist. In smoky back rooms, they became gentlemen gamblers, reading tells, palming cards, and walking away with the purses of smug industrialists and crooked officials who thought the world belonged to them. It was a story of quiet theft, of humiliation rather than blood. Hosea thrived in those roles. He watched, listened, waited. He knew when to fold a scam early, when a mark's eyes lingered too long or a sheriff's boots sounded too close on the saloon floor. Dutch, by contrast, could not help performing. He delivered speeches at poker tables, railing against bankers and rail barons even as he cleaned them out, turning each con into a sermon about how the old ways were dying and the common man was being crushed under progress. Together, they were in the truest sense a dual leadership. Hosea was the brake, Dutch the accelerator. Hosea counted exits and escape routes, Dutch counted hearts and minds. When Dutch's big, risky ideas threatened to spiral, Hosea's pragmatism and patience pulled them back from the edge. When Hosea's caution threatened to smother their ambition, Dutch's charisma pushed them to take the leap that made the difference between scraping by and thriving. At night, when the money was hidden and the disguises were off, the real work began. Around campfires in the Grizzlies or under the wide sky of New Hanover, they argued and dreamed. Dutch spoke of a world without kings, governments, or rail companies, a world where men and women could live by their own code, not the laws of distant politicians. Hosea, older and more tired than he let on, reminded him that every empire, even an outlaw one, risked becoming what it hated. From its humble beginnings, their philosophy hardened into something resembling a code. Avoid unnecessary bloodshed, especially civilians. Target the wealthy and corrupt, the men who had already stolen from everyone else. Never abandon a partner. Take in the drifters, the broken, the lost soul, who had nowhere else to go, and make them family. In those early years, Dutch held to that code with a conviction that felt unshakable. He turned down jobs that smelled of slaughter. He walked away from easy money when Hosea said the risk to their people was too high. Yet even then, tiny fractures showed. Dutch saw the code as a weapon, a banner to rally under, something that could bend when the prize was great enough. Hosea saw it as a boundary that could not be crossed without losing everything. Dutch wanted to change the world. Hosea wanted to survive it. Which vision would win when the first true proch stepped into their firelight, hungry for guidance and ready to believe every word Dutch said? The first prot did not enter a gang in the usual sense. He stepped into a moving experiment. From its humble beginnings, Dutch and Hosea were not merely assembling a crew of guns, they were testing whether a handful of outlaws could become, in the truest sense, their own small civilization. Their camps in those early years were more than hideouts. They were miniature societies, pitched in river valleys and pine forests, on the edges of towns that barely had names. A communal fire at the center, wagons in a loose circle, bedrolls tucked beneath canvas and stars. Food, ammunition, and money went into shared stores, then back out according to need rather than rank. Strays drifted in, drifters, orphans, widows, every lost soul who had nowhere else to go, and found not just work, but a place at the table. There were rules, even if no lawman had written them. No mistreating women or children, no stealing from camp, no senseless killing that brought heat on everyone. Disputes were settled in low voices or loud arguments around the fire, but the decision, once made, was respected. It was rough and imperfect, but to those inside it felt like family forged by choice instead of blood. For many, it was the first family that had ever chosen them back. Dutch stood at the center of it, not only as leader, but as teacher and preacher. Nights that might have been spent in drunken silence became lessons. He read aloud from tattered books, quoted speeches and half-remembered philosophy, railing against railroads, bankers, and politicians who fenced off the horizon. Crime, in his telling, was not greed. It was resistance. Robbing a train or a coach was framed as striking a blow for freedom against a world determined to crush anyone without money or power. Hosea made sure those sermons did not get everyone killed. While Dutch worked on morale and ideology, Hosea handled the invisible machinery that kept the dream alive. He found contacts who would buy stolen goods without asking questions, mapped routes that dodged patrols, and ensured there was always a way out before Dutch ever gave the word to draw guns. One man fed the soul of the camp, the other kept its stomach full and its trail cold. At times, the contrast between them was almost ironic. Dutch would be standing on a crate declaring that the gang was the living embodiment of freedom, while Hosea, a few feet away, quietly calculated how many cans of beans were left and whether the next town had a doctor. Yet that tension was exactly what made their early world work. Idealism and practicality, dream and ledger, riding side by side. This was not yet the paranoid cult huddled in the caves of Beaver Hollow. This was a traveling commune on horseback. A story of men and women trying to live beyond the reach of a country that no longer wanted their kind. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but for a brief moment around those fires, it felt as if another future was possible. The question was not whether it felt real to them. The question was how long such a fragile philosophy could survive once blood, grief. And ambition began to test every promise Dutch had ever made. Around those fires, Dutch began to turn vague grievances into a doctrine. He did not just complain that the world was changing, he insisted that it had been stolen. To him, government was not an institution but a gang with better stationery, the living embodiment of hypocrisy, wearing a badge and a seal. From its humble beginnings, his philosophy sounded almost noble. His father had died in a uniform, fed into the machinery of the Civil War, and Dutch never forgave the country that had promised honor and delivered a grave. In his eyes, the rich had not earned their railroads and mansions. They had taken them, brick by brick, from the poor, the immigrant, the forgotten. Laws were simply chains written in ink, drafted by cowards who let others do their killing for them. True freedom, he told anyone who would listen, meant living beyond the reach of those laws, beyond civilization's smug little rules. So the gang was never just a crew to him. It was a family first and an outlaw outfit second. In the truest sense, a refuge for every lost soul the world had chewed up and spat out. He promised protection to those who had none, belonging to those who had been cast aside, and a chance to be something more than what society had already decided they were. Around the camp, Dutch was not merely a leader. He was a teacher, a father, a prophet of a different future. Their code reflected that balance of tenderness and violence. They would rob trains and stagecoaches, but only those stuffed with bonds, payrolls, and the savings of men Dutch swore were already thieves in better suits. They would avoid killing innocents when they could, steer clear of wanton bloodshed, and protect women and children with a ferocity that bordered on religious. But lawmen, Pinkertons, rival gangs who stood in the way, those deaths were not just acceptable, they were framed as righteous resistance, bullets fired in self-defense against a corrupt civilization. Hosea believed in that code, at least enough to live by it. Yet his belief was quieter, shaded with a skepticism Dutch refused to entertain. He knew that beneath the speeches and the dreams, this was still a story of robbery and flight, of crime dressed up as philosophy. Romanticizing their life, he understood, could be as dangerous as any gunfight. How long could men convince themselves they were heroes while counting stolen money in the dark? That was the flaw hidden from the very beginning. The code was flexible, elastic, always ready to bend in Dutch's favor. If robbery could be called justice, then cruelty could be called necessity, and betrayal could, one day, be called sacrifice. In that loophole, every promise he made contained its own escape hatch, setting the stage for a future where almost anything could be excused. Even the very betrayals he swore he would never commit. That escape hatch did more than justify tomorrow's violence. It gave Dutch a stage tonight. When the guns were cleaned, the coffee boiled, and the prairie went quiet, he turned every campfire into a classroom. This was not merely an outlaw camp. In the truest sense, it was a traveling lecture hall with saddles and rifles. Dutch would sit forward in the firelight, hat pushed back, cigar glowing, and begin to quote Shakespeare, the Bible, scraps of poetry half remembered from a childhood he romanticized more than he recalled. He spoke of Rome and revolution, of kings and tyrants, of the way the world was changing and crushing the poor beneath the wheels of civilization. A train robbery was never just a robbery. It was, in his telling, an act in a grand story of resistance. A story of freedom against a rigged order that had murdered his father and stolen the country. Around him, tired men and women listened as their crimes were reframed as a kind of philosophy. Dutch would take a simple holdup and stretch it into a parable about bankers and rail barons, about governments that sent boys to die in war and then forgot their names. Was it theft, he asked, if the rich had already stolen the world? Was it murder if the law had no mercy for the poor? In those moments, under those stars, even the roughest killer could feel like a revolutionary rather than a fugitive. From its humble beginnings, that campfire rhetoric came with something rarer: lessons. Dutch and Hosea brought in boys who could barely write their own names and handed them tattered books instead of just bottles and bullets. Dutch insisted his people read, argued with them about politics, pushed them to question newspapers and speeches and the polished lies of civilization. They were not to be brutes. They were to be thinkers forced into outlawry by betrayal from a corrupt system. He would trace letters in the dirt, correct pronunciation, demand that a man who could shoot straight should also be able to read a contract, or tear one apart. In those long nights, a lost soul could become a student. The gang became the living embodiment of his belief that the old ways were dying, and that someone had to stand against the tide. This is what set Dutch apart from the average gang boss of the era. Where others barked orders, he delivered speeches. Where others promised loot, he promised meaning. To ride with him was to feel part of something larger than hunger and fear, something almost noble, even as blood dried on the same hands that turned pages. But there was ego in every lesson. Dutch loved the sound of his own voice, the way faces turned toward him, the way silence fell when he lifted a hand. He believed what he said, fiercely, Yet he also cherished the feeling of being at the center of his own myth, the philosopher outlaw starring in his private revolution. Soon, he would find the perfect audience for that myth, the perfect student for that philosophy, a boy who would absorb every word, build his whole identity around them, and follow Dutch Van Der Linde into both glory and ruin. Arthur Morgan was about to step into the firelight. Arthur Morgan did not step into that firelight as a man with a code. He came as a boy who had already seen too much of the world and understood almost nothing about his place in it. Before he was the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, he was just a name on a warrant and a pair of angry eyes watching civilization close in. From its humble beginnings, Arthur's story was a story of absence. His father, Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal of the old breed, drifting from town to town, running small cons, stealing what he could. There was no grand philosophy to it, no talk of freedom or justice, only survival and a bottle whenever there was money to spare. The law finally caught up to Lyle when Arthur was still young. Arrest, a cold cell, and a death that came without glory or warning left Arthur effectively orphaned, with no mother in sight and no real family to claim him. That loss did not make him gentle. It made him hard but not yet hollow. The boy who watched his father disappear behind iron bars learned quickly that the world was changing and that the old ways were dying, yet no one explained what should replace them. He grew up angry and lonely, already used to the sight of blood and bruises, but still aching for structure, for a hand on his shoulder that did not shove him away. He wanted approval from someone, anyone, who could tell him that his life meant more than a rap sheet. In those years, his crimes were born of hunger, not ideology. A stolen horse to get out of a town that hated him, a lifted wallet in a crowded street when his stomach twisted with emptiness, a fight that went too far behind a saloon when an older man called him a stray. Each act brought him closer to the law, closer to the fate that had swallowed Lyle. After a few narrow escapes and one long, humiliating night in a makeshift jail, Arthur began to understand a simple truth. Without guidance, he would end up in prison or in the ground before he had truly lived. He was tough, fast with his fists, already deadly with a gun, but in the truest sense he was still a blank slate. No real beliefs, no grand dreams, no philosophy beyond staying alive. He was an outlaw by circumstance, not conviction, a lost soul wandering the edges of a world that did not care if he vanished. What would happen if someone finally offered him not just work, but meaning? The answer came on a dirt road during a botched robbery. Arthur picked the wrong stagecoach, or perhaps the right one, because inside it were two men who had planned to rob the very same target. Guns were drawn, tempers flared, and for a moment 3 strangers stared each other down, each deciding whether this would end in blood or something far more dangerous. In that split second, Dutch Van Der Linde and Hosea Matthews made a choice about the angry boy in front of them, and that choice would shape the fate of their entire gang. The road did not know it yet, but history had just taken a turn. Dutch moved first, not with the gun, but with his voice. The boy in front of them was all sharp edges and shaking hands, a revolver too big for his grip and eyes that had already seen too much. Arthur Morgan, barely a teenager, had tried to stick up 2 men who were in the middle of trying to rob the same coach. It was, in the truest sense, a comedy of errors balanced on the edge of a tragedy. Dutch saw the fear. Hosea saw the angles. The world was changing. But a desperate boy with nothing was still the oldest story on the road. Dutch did not bark an order or pull the trigger. He smiled, almost gently, and started asking questions. Was Arthur alone? Did he have people? What did he think was waiting for him if he kept stumbling through this outlaw life on his own? Each question was a test, not of skill, but of loyalty, of desire, of whether there was anything inside this boy beyond hunger and rage. Arthur answered with gruff half-truths, then with silence, then with something close to honesty. His father was gone. His mother was dead. Civilization had no place for him. Freedom, for Arthur, meant not starving tomorrow. That was it. No dreams, no philosophy, no grand delusions about changing the world. Hosea watched his posture, his eyes, the way he held that gun even when his arms trembled. Strong, quick, young enough to be shaped, old enough to understand danger. From its humble beginnings, the Van Der Linde partnership had been practical as much as idealistic, and Hosea could see the practical value immediately. A boy like this could haul, fight, ride, learn. A boy like this could be the living embodiment of their future. Dutch, though, was already seeing something else. Not a recruit, a cause. He stepped closer, slowly, until the barrel between them might as well have been a twig. Dutch talked about the world being rigged, about the old ways were dying under railroads and bankers, about men who refused to bow. Then he did something no one had ever done for Arthur Morgan. He offered more than a job, a place by the fire, a bedroll that would not be kicked away at dawn, food that did not come with a beating, people who would stand with him when bullets started flying, family, even if no one dared say the word yet. For Arthur, it was overwhelming. This was not being recruited. This was being rescued from a future already written in blood and hunger. In that moment, Dutch's hand on his shoulder felt less like possession and more like salvation. For Dutch, it was proof. If he could take a lost soul and turn him into something better, then his whole philosophy was justified. This was a story of freedom and belonging, of a boy remade by a man who believed he could outthink civilization itself. And as Arthur agreed to ride with them, Dutch and Hosea did not just gain another gun, they gained a son. That promise at the roadside would echo through every campfire that followed, and it would make the betrayals to come cut far deeper than any bullet. Because once a man has been given a family, what happens when that family starts to fall apart? From that moment, Arthur did not just join a gang, he stepped into a home with two very different fathers. That tension between them, and within him, would become one of the quiet engines of this entire story. Dutch moved first on Arthur's mind. In the evenings, when the fire burned low and the whiskey softened the edges of the world, Dutch would pull out tattered books and newspapers, tracing the words with a gloved finger as Arthur followed. He taught the boy to read, to quote speeches, to see himself not as a petty thief, but as a thinking man standing against a corrupt civilization. Freedom, Dutch insisted, was not just the absence of chains, it was the right to live beyond the reach of governments, railroads, and bankers who had never worked a day in their lives. For Dutch, Arthur became the living embodiment of his philosophy. A rough, half-wild orphan, reshaped into an idealistic outlaw with a code and a cause. Dutch spoke of the old ways dying, of the world closing in, of the need for men of principle to resist. Arthur listened, absorbed, believed. From its humble beginnings around those campfires, Dutch's rhetoric became scripture to the boy. Hosea's lessons were quieter, closer to the ground, and far less romantic. While Dutch filled Arthur's head with dreams, Hosea filled his hands with work. He showed him how to pick a pocket without a ripple, how to watch the rhythm of a town and spot the law before the law spotted him, how to plan 3 escape routes before a job even began. When Dutch talked about honor, Hosea talked about survival. When Dutch dreamed of grand gestures, Hosea reminded Arthur when to walk away from a bad job, no matter how glorious Dutch made it sound. In the truest sense, Arthur grew up between those two poles, Dutch's soaring speeches and Hosea's practical murmurs. He became a surrogate son to both men, leaning into Dutch's praise with a hungry heart and seeking Hosea's quiet nods when doubt crept in. Dutch made him feel important, chosen, part of something bigger than himself. Hosea made him feel prepared, grounded, aware of how quickly a glorious plan could turn into a noose. Every time Arthur repeated Dutch's words to a new recruit, every time he defended Dutch's philosophy around the fire, a loop of validation tightened. Dutch saw his ideas reflected in Arthur's gravelly voice and took it as proof that he was right, that his cause was just, that the gang was more than crime. As long as Arthur believed, the dream still shone, but the world was changing and the cracks were already there. What happens to a father's dream when the son who carries it starts seeing the bodies left behind, the lies beneath the speeches, the things Dutch refuses to admit? Those cracks did not begin with gunsmoke and Pinkertons. They began in the quiet, controlled robberies where Dutch Van Der Linde seemed to prove, again and again, that his philosophy worked, that an outlaw could be the living embodiment of honor in a dying world. One of Arthur's first real tests came on a cold, clear night when Dutch planned a train robbery with the precision of a military officer and the conscience of a preacher. He rode the line days in advance, counting telegraph poles between bends, memorizing the distance from the last station to a narrow cutting where the train would have to slow. No civilians in the cars they wanted, no guards beyond what the gang could handle, a clean jump-off point into thick timber. From its humble beginnings, the plan was built around one idea: Get rich without getting bloody. Arthur learned the rules in the saddle, the lantern glow catching Dutch's face as he spoke. No killing unless there is no choice. No cruelty, not to passengers, not to workers just trying to feed their families. Take what is needed, leave them scared but alive, and disappear before civilization has time to understand what happened. Freedom, Dutch said, was not chaos. It was discipline, purpose, and the refusal to bow. On the night itself, the story unfolded almost exactly as Dutch promised. The train slowed where he said it would, the gang boarded where the moonlight was weakest, and the guards were disarmed rather than executed. When a young Pinkerton wannabe reached for a hidden pistol, it was Arthur who hesitated and Dutch who moved, stepping between them. Taking a grazing shot across his shoulder as he slammed the man into the wall and barked for everyone to stand down. Better Dutch bleed than a corpse on the floor and a murder charge on Arthur's conscience. Moments came when greed tempted them. A safe that took too long to crack, a rumor of bonds in another car, a conductor insisting there was more hidden further back. Each time, Dutch called it. They had enough. The risk was rising. The gang's freedom mattered more than an extra stack of bills. To Arthur, still young, still searching for a father in the truest sense, this restraint was everything. Here was an outlaw who protected his family, who stepped into danger to pull them out of it, who proved that dreams of rebellion did not have to mean slaughter. Yet even on that clean job, there were hints of the man he would become. The way Dutch's voice rose when the passengers cowered, the theatrical pause before he promised them mercy, the faint smile when the safe finally yielded. Was it principle that thrilled him, or power? In those days, Arthur did not ask. He only saw success, heard Dutch's speeches, and believed. But the old ways were dying, and in that narrow space between restraint and control, something darker was already taking root. For Arthur, that darkness had no name yet. What he saw, what he clung to, was the man standing in front of it. At this stage of the story, Dutch Van Der Linde was still, in Arthur's mind, the best man he had ever known, not just an outlaw leader, but a father who had dragged a wild teenager out of the gutter and handed him a purpose. From the very beginning, Dutch had given Arthur more than a gun and a bedroll. He had handed him a philosophy. He taught him to read, to quote scraps of poetry by the fire, to talk about freedom and civilization as if they were enemies locked in an endless duel. Hosea might have shown Arthur how the world really worked, but Dutch showed him how the world should work, in the truest sense. That difference mattered. It turned crime into cause, robbery into rebellion. So Arthur began to measure himself against Dutch's ideals. He was no longer just stealing to survive. He was upholding a code. They robbed the rich when they could, avoided senseless killing, and walked away from jobs that smelled too cruel. Arthur took pride in not being a common bandit, in being part of something that, at least in his eyes, was bigger than greed. If Dutch said they were building a future where the gang could live free, then every bullet Arthur fired, every risk he took, became a brick in that invisible house. That belief did not grow in speeches alone. It grew in the quiet moments. After a hard job, Dutch would come to Arthur's tent, lantern in hand, asking if the wounds hurt, if the ride had been too rough. He would pour a drink, sit beside him, and talk softly about the day Arthur would not have to bleed for money anymore. There were nights when Dutch clapped a hand on Arthur's shoulder and said, simply, that he was proud. A criminal's blessing, given under the stars, became the living embodiment of family for a boy who had lost his bloodkin long ago. These scenes are not just background color. They are the emotional engine of Red Dead Redemption 2's first half. The player rides with Arthur through snow and mud, hears him defend Dutch around the campfire, feels his loyalty harden every time Dutch chooses the gang over his own safety. When Pinkertons close in or plans go wrong, Arthur's first instinct is not doubt. It is defense. How could the man who saved so many lost souls be the villain? That is why the eventual betrayals cut so deep. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, has to earn its heartbreak, and Dutch earns Arthur's devotion from its humble beginnings. So the question becomes unavoidable. If Dutch could win Arthur Morgan's faith so completely, what happens when he turns that same charm, that same hunger to save and to be believed, on someone who does not want to be saved in the same way, a stubborn young outlaw named John Marston? John Marston's path into Dutch's world does not begin with a speech or a grand robbery. It begins with absence. No father to drag him to a campfire code, no mother to pull him away from danger, only the revolving doors of orphanages and the cold indifference of institutions that claim to protect children while barely keeping them alive. From the very beginning, John's life is a story of being passed around. Orphanages in this era were the living embodiment of neglect dressed up as charity, overcrowded dormitories, spoiled food, beatings handed out faster than blankets. In those halls, promises came cheap and punishments came quick. Adults preached morality in the morning and pocketed donations at night. The lesson sank in early. Authority meant hunger, humiliation, and the constant threat of being thrown out into a world that did not care if a boy froze to death. So John ran. He ran young, before his voice had settled, slipping out through back doors and alleyways, trading one kind of danger for another. On the streets, freedom was brutal but honest. A boy stole or went hungry. He slept in stables, under porches, in half-collapsed sheds at the edge of railroad towns where the old ways were dying and the tracks of civilization carved through the countryside. Petty theft, odd jobs, mucking out stalls, carrying coal, holding horses outside saloons, anything for a few coins, a crust of bread, or a place on the floor by the stove. In that world, John learned to survive with his hands and with his mouth. Sarcasm became armor. Defiance became a weapon. If an adult offered kindness, there was a price. If someone promised family, there was a catch. Where Arthur Morgan had once craved structure and approval, desperate to impress Dutch and Hosea and prove that he belonged, John learned the opposite lesson. Attachment was dangerous, dependence was a trap, and every oath of loyalty could turn into betrayal the moment it stopped being convenient. This contrast matters. Arthur grew up wanting a father and found one in Dutch. John grew up expecting abandonment and treated every new bond as temporary. One boy leaned in, the other leaned away. Arthur was drawn to Dutch's philosophy, to the idea that an outlaw could be noble, that their camp was, in the truest sense, a chosen family. John, shaped by beatings and broken promises, heard lofty speeches about freedom and justice, and quietly measured them against empty stomachs and locked dormitory doors. And yet, that same broken childhood made John the perfect candidate for Dutch's dream of gathering lost souls. A hungry, half-feral teenager who could already steal, fight, and read danger in a man's eyes was exactly the kind of stray Dutch loved to rescue. But where Arthur surrendered almost completely to Dutch's charm, John never quite bowed. Dutch would see another son to save. John would see a charismatic outlaw who might walk away when the world was changing again. That tension, faith on one side, skepticism on the other, will haunt their story. Because what happens when a man who needs to be believed meets a boy who has sworn never to believe anyone fully again? So when Dutch met John Marston, he recognized the pattern immediately. Another angry boy with nowhere to go. Another lost soul raging at a world that had already decided his worth. But this time, the meeting did not begin with rescue. It began with a gun. John was barely a teenager, half-starved and half-feral, trying to rob a stagecoach on a lonely road. It was a clumsy stick-up, all bravado and no plan, the kind of desperate act that ended with a noose more often than freedom. The passengers froze, John's hands shook. Then a calm voice from behind cut through the panic, and a revolver pressed to the back of his neck. Dutch had been watching the same coach, waiting for his moment. Two outlaws, in the truest sense, had just tried to rob the same target at the same time. Hosea stepped out of the brush first, disarming John with practiced ease, while Dutch studied the boy's eyes. There was fear there, and defiance, and something he knew from Arthur's face years before, the stubborn refusal to simply lie down and accept what civilization had done to him. From its humble beginnings, Dutch's philosophy had always made room for boys like this. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and he would be the man who saved those left behind. He holstered his gun and began the speech he knew by heart, a story of freedom and family, of standing together against a system that chewed people up and spat them out. He told John he could be more than a petty thief, more than a nameless body in an unmarked grave. Under Dutch's guidance, he said, a man could learn to read, to think, to fight for something bigger than himself. It was almost word for word what he had told Arthur. Dutch was the living embodiment of his own myth, and he believed every syllable. But where Arthur had leaned in, John leaned back. He listened because he had a gun on him and no real choice, not because the dream moved him. He agreed to ride with them because the alternative was prison or worse, not because he trusted this charismatic outlaw with the slick words and grand ideals. In those first days, John tested everything. He watched who Dutch protected, who he sacrificed, how often his lofty speeches matched the bloody reality of the work. Hosea saw it clearly. Dutch was drawn to projects, to boys he could mold into proof that his philosophy worked. Arthur had been clay in his hands, John was flint. So Hosea took the quieter role, teaching John to hunt, to track, to keep his head when Dutch's plans ran hot. He did not demand faith, he offered competence. And so the gang rode on with two surrogate sons at its heart, one eager believer and one wary skeptic. Holding both together would become Dutch's greatest test, and the fault line that would one day split the entire family wide open. That fault line did not stay theoretical for long. It had faces, tempers, and bruised egos. It had Arthur Morgan and John Marston circling each other around Dutch's campfires, each one seeing in the other a reflection he did not entirely trust. From the very beginning, Arthur felt the shift when John arrived. For years he had been the first son, the living embodiment of Dutch's philosophy, the one Dutch pointed to when he spoke about freedom, loyalty, and family in the truest sense. Suddenly there was this younger, sharper, rough-around-the-edges kid who could ride hard, shoot straight, and make Dutch laugh. Arthur bristled at the competition, but beneath the resentment ran something quieter. A protective instinct for a boy who reminded him uncomfortably of himself. John, for his part, saw Arthur's devotion and poked at it the way a stray dog tests a fence. Where Arthur listened to Dutch's speeches as if they were scripture, John heard performance. After a long day robbing a train full of terrified workers rather than rich parasites, John might mutter, half under his breath, whether Dutch's grand talk about robbing the corrupt matched the reality of shaking down poor men for their last wages. Was this rebellion, or just outlaw work dressed up in pretty words? Those questions led to small, early arguments that seemed trivial at the time. Around the fire after a job, Arthur would repeat Dutch's line about civilization being a cage and their gang being a story of resistance, of dreams standing against a rigged world. John would shrug and point out the bodies left behind, or the families whose savings had just funded Dutch's latest idealistic scheme. Arthur insisted the cause mattered, that they were different from common bandits. John answered that the Pinkertons would not care about philosophy when the noose went around their necks. Dutch loved stepping between them. He turned their attention into theater, a lesson for the whole camp. One hand on Arthur's shoulder, one on John's, he would praise Arthur's faith and John's skepticism in the same breath, insisting that a great mind needed both conviction and doubt. In those moments he stood above them, the wise father mediating squabbling brothers, from its humble beginnings crafting an image of himself as the man who could hold every contradiction together. Yet each quarrel left a residue. Arthur walked away more determined to defend Dutch's honor. John walked away more certain that someone needed to keep count of the hypocrisies piling up. The family functioned, but it was fragile, held in place by Dutch's charisma and Hosea's quiet competence. What would happen when pressures came that no speech could smooth over? The answer would not arrive from a drunken argument or a botched card game. It would ride in from the horizon, carried on railroads, telegraphs, and government rifles. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the first true test of this fragile family was about to come from far beyond the glow of their campfire light. Those rail lines and rifle barrels were not just scenery, they were the new spine of a different America, tightening around men like Dutch Van Der Linde. From its humble beginnings in scattered camps and backwater towns, the frontier was being stitched together, mile by mile, wire by wire. Steel tracks cut across prairies, telegraph poles marched along them, and with each nail driven, the distance between lawmen and outlaw shrank. In the late 1870s and 1880s, this was no longer the wild, unclaimed west of dime novels. Trains ran on strict timetables, carrying payrolls, soldiers, and Pinkerton agents with equal efficiency. Telegraph keys clicked through the night, sending descriptions of robberies and faces in minutes instead of weeks. A posse did not have to ride blind anymore. A sheriff in one town could warn the next three down the line before a gang's horses had cooled. The world was changing, and it was changing fast. Private agencies, the Pinkertons most of all, became the living embodiment of this new order. They were not local deputies with grudges and hangovers. They were salaried, disciplined, and backed by banks and rail companies that considered outlaws not romantic figures, but bad investments. Every robbery was a ledger entry. Every dead guard was a cost to be recouped. Their response was simple: harsher crackdowns, longer hunts, fewer second chances. For a gang built on escape, on vanishing into the gaps between towns and the silences between telegraph stations, this was an existential threat. Faster communication meant less room for error, less time to disappear, less margin for Dutch's theatrical flourishes. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, was suddenly also a story of timetables, patrol routes, and corporate pressure. Dutch felt it like a personal insult. Around the campfire, his speeches grew sharper, more apocalyptic. He pointed to the railroads and called them chains. He gestured at the telegraph wires and named them a spider's web of civilization, spun to catch free men and women. In the truest sense, he saw every new line on the map as a bar in a cage, proof that the old ways were dying and that his philosophy of roaming freedom was under siege. Was a man free if every town knew his name before he arrived? Hosea, ever the pragmatist, watched the same changes with a cooler eye. He did not deny Dutch's anger, but he understood something his friend resisted: the tide would not turn back. The world was changing whether they liked it or not, and clinging to the past would only get them killed. If they wanted to survive as outlaws, their methods had to evolve. Smaller cons would not cut it against companies that could replace their losses with a signature on a form. So a new pattern emerged. Fewer petty swindles, more ambitious scores. Trains instead of stagecoaches. Banks instead of lone travelers. More men and women brought into the fold to pull off jobs that matched the scale of the new America they were defying. Was it survival, or the beginning of a fatal escalation? As the gang expanded and the risks grew, Dutch's dream of freedom began racing headlong against history itself, and only one of them could win. Those bigger dreams needed more than 2 men and a couple of half-grown sons. To rob trains and banks in a world hardening under railroads and telegraph lines, Dutch and Hosea needed a tribe. From its humble beginnings as a partnership, the Van Der Linde gang began to stretch, to pull in other drifting lives. Bill Williamson came first, or close enough that the exact order hardly matters. A discharged soldier with a temper and a drinking problem, he was found slumped outside a Fort Town saloon, half frozen and half determined to pick a fight with the entire world. Dutch saw past the belligerence to the uniform, to the discipline buried beneath shame. Here was a man trained by the very civilization Dutch despised, now discarded by it. Dutch offered him food, fire, and a purpose that sounded nobler than standing guard over some railroad baron's payroll. The pattern began to repeat, almost ritual in the truest sense. A lost soul on the brink, a hand extended, a promise of family in exchange for loyalty. Javier Escuela fit that pattern perfectly. A revolutionary turned outlaw drifting north from Mexico, hunted for killings that were part politics, part survival, and all unforgivable to the authorities. Dutch and Hosea found him playing guitar outside a cheap border town inn, fingers bleeding, eyes watchful. Dutch heard not just music, but conviction. Javier believed in resistance, in fighting back. That made him a brother before he ever shared a campfire. Each new arrival changed the air around the camp. Bill brought muscle and volatility, the living embodiment of Dutch's need to tame violence rather than simply wield it. Javier added romance and ideology, reinforcing Dutch's own philosophy that their crimes were a story of rebellion, not mere greed. Even early on, Dutch was less gang leader than ringmaster and surrogate father, juggling egos, soothing tempers, and assigning roles so that no one felt useless, but no one felt irreplaceable. Arthur, having been there from the very beginning, took to the growing numbers with a quiet, almost older brother pride. More men meant bigger scores, less risk on each individual, and more laughter around the fire. He taught Bill how to track, rode out with Javier on scouting trips, and seemed to expand into the role Dutch had carved for him: dependable, steady, the one who could bridge tempers before they boiled over. Was this not what family was supposed to be? John, newer and more thin-skinned, felt the expansion differently. Trust, for him, had always been scarce. Each fresh face was another rival for Dutch's attention. Another potential betrayal waiting behind an easy grin. He watched Bill's rages with suspicion, listened to Javier's stories with narrowed eyes, and pulled back when others leaned in. Where Arthur saw brothers, John saw competition. As the campfires multiplied and the circle widened, Dutch's ambitions grew to match. With a true crew behind him, he began to speak of coordinated train robberies, multi-stage bank jobs, and raids that would echo across territories. The first of those grand designs was coming, a job that would prove the gang's legend and start to bend Dutch's restraint towards something darker. That first grand design was a train, heavy with bonds and bullion, crawling through the heart of a world Dutch believed was rotting from the inside. It was not just a robbery to him. It was a statement. From its humble beginnings, the plan showed his particular genius. Days before the job, he sent Bill and Javier ahead as railroad workers, planting charges along a lonely stretch of track. Hosea rode into town as a harmless drifter, spreading rumors of bandits in the hills to pull extra guards toward the wrong sector. Arthur and John scouted the terrain, marking gullies, tree lines, and the narrow ravine that would become their escape route. Dutch stitched it all together, pacing the fire, drawing lines in the dirt, turning chaos into choreography. On the night itself, the gang waited in the dark, horses tied, faces wrapped, every breath held to his timing. Dutch walked the line of men and women, hand on shoulders, voice low but burning. He spoke of freedom and civilization, of how the old ways were dying under iron rails and factory smoke. He told them this was not theft but reclamation, taking back what the rich had stolen. In the truest sense, he framed it as a story of justice, not greed. Then the theater began. A decoy wagon, staged as stranded travelers, drew the train to a screeching halt. Timed explosives blew the rail just behind the last car, sealing it in. Dutch rode out of the smoke at the precise second, coat flaring, pistol raised but aimed at the sky, shouting for calm. Guards went for guns. Dutch barked orders that sounded less like threats and more like commands from a seasoned officer. Surrender and no one dies. Resist and the railroad pays the price. He was the living embodiment of his own philosophy in that moment. No shots fired unless forced. No cruelty, no terror for its own sake. The targets were bonds belonging to a mining conglomerate that had evicted families up in the Grizzlies. Dutch made sure everyone in the gang knew that detail. It mattered to him that they believed the myth he was building, that they saw themselves as outlaws with a cause. The job went clean. A single warning shot, a bruised guard, and then chests of paper wealth loaded onto pack horses as the train crew watched, shaken but alive. That night, under a blanket of stars, the camp turned wild. Bottles passed, songs rose, and every story around the fire grew taller. They toasted Dutch as mastermind, as protector, as savior. For a moment, loyalty was effortless. For a moment, the dreams felt real. But perfection breeds expectation. Each success demanded something bigger, bolder, more theatrical, and it was on one of those later, carefully plotted jobs, another train, another speech, another promise of no bloodshed, when the first crack truly showed. A guard reached for a hidden pistol. A shot rang out that was not in the script, and Dutch found himself staring at a wounded man and a choice: hold to his code, or hold to the legend he had sworn the gang would never lose. Which mattered more to him in that instant, the life on the ground, or the story in his head? In that frozen instant, Dutch's world narrowed to a single wounded guard gasping on a polished marble floor. The plan had been perfect in his mind. A quiet bank job on the edge of a growing town. A simple demonstration that the rich could be touched and the poor could strike back. No blood, no bodies, only a story of resistance carried on the whispering tongues of working men. Instead, a young guard, barely more than a boy, had panicked. His hand had gone for a hidden pistol. Someone flinched, and Hosea's warning hiss turned into a gunshot echoing off the walls. The guard lay there now, clutching his side, eyes wide, the very beginning of a legend Dutch had not intended to write. Behind Dutch, Arthur and John waited for the order, hearts hammering, their faith colliding with the chaos in front of them. This was the choice. Retreat, drag the wounded boy behind the counter, abandon the vault, and walk out with nothing but damaged pride. Or press on, keep the timetable, and accept that the clean line he had drawn between necessary force and needless blood was already smudged. To fall back meant questions from Bill, doubt from Javier, whispers that Dutch had lost his nerve. To push forward meant admitting, if only to himself, that his philosophy bent when his reputation was on the line. For a heartbeat, the old ways were dying in his eyes. The idealistic teacher who quoted books and spoke of freedom and civilization in the same breath hesitated over a single life. Then the outlaw leader, the living embodiment of his own legend, took over. Dutch stepped closer, revolver steady. The guard's fingers twitched toward his gun again, more reflex than threat. Dutch fired once, clean and final. The room went silent. Arthur felt the sound more than heard it, a dull weight settling somewhere behind his ribs. Dutch had always said they were different, that from its humble beginnings the gang would stand apart from butchers and cutthroats. Yet here was a boy on the floor and Dutch holstering his weapon, as if this too had been part of the plan. Had to be done, Dutch said, voice calm, almost gentle. He framed it as mercy, as necessity, as protection of their family. The law would have killed the guard for failing his duty, he argued. Dutch had only shortened the road. Was that not, in the truest sense, an act of kindness in a cruel world? Arthur believed him. Or he wanted to. Loyalty, habit, and gratitude all leaned toward acceptance. But somewhere beneath the surface, a question lodged and refused to move. If Dutch's code could stretch for this boy, how far could it stretch for a bigger score, a louder legend, a grander dream? As the gang rode away with saddlebags heavier than their consciences, that tiny fracture in Arthur's faith rode with them, waiting for the next compromise to widen it. And the next one would not be long in coming. But for a time, the next compromise did not arrive with gunfire. It came with lantern light, fiddle music, and the low murmur of tired outlaws pretending, for a few stolen hours, that civilization had never found them. On those rare quiet nights, the camp became something else entirely. No ambushes, no Pinkertons in the tree line, no desperate ride to the next score. Just coffee boiling over the fire, Javier coaxing a melody from his guitar, Strauss shuffling his cards, and Dutch moving through it all like a benevolent king holding court. He would rest a hand on a shoulder here, share a cigarette there, quoting books half remembered and speeches half invented, the living embodiment of his own philosophy about freedom and family. Arthur would sit near the fire, sketchbook open, pretending not to listen. John, younger and still hungry to prove himself, leaned in closer than he would ever admit, soaking up every word. Around them, the gang settled, Bill nursing a bottle, Charles quietly whittling, Abigail rocking Jack to sleep as the boy's small head sagged against her arm. It was a story of criminals, yet in those moments it felt in the truest sense like a home. Dutch would talk about the future then, not as a fantasy, but as if it were already written. One last job, one last train, one last bank, one last score that would buy a little piece of world beyond the reach of the railroads and the telegraph wires. He spoke of a ranch in some distant territory, or a cabin by a lake where the snow fell soft and no one asked questions. Was it a dream or already a delusion? No one wanted to look too closely at the answer. Hosea was always there to prick the bubble. Gently, he would lean back, hat tipped over his eyes, and ask how this miracle land expected to feed a dozen outlaws who could barely cook beans without burning them. He would point out, with a wry smile, that the world was changing faster than any horse could outrun, that the old ways were dying whether Dutch liked it or not. Yet the teasing never felt like betrayal. It was the pressure valve, the conscience that kept Dutch's soaring speeches tethered to the ground. These nights revealed the gang from its humble beginnings, not as a collection of guns, but as a fragile, chosen family. Around that fire, loyalty was not a word shouted before a robbery. It was Charles quietly sharing a blanket, Sadie laughing for the first time in weeks, Javier switching songs when he noticed Hosea's eyes cloud at a certain tune. Even Micah, on his better evenings, could be found listening at the edge of the light, a lost soul trying to learn the language of belonging. For Arthur and John, those ordinary evenings carved themselves into memory. Leaving the gang later would not feel like walking away from a job. It would feel like tearing out a piece of themselves that had learned to believe in Dutch's promise. That is what makes this more than a story of crime and ideas. Before the betrayals, before the banks and the bodies, there were nights when they laughed, loved, and believed together. And it is those memories, not the gunfights, that will haunt them when the next compromise finally arrives, and this fragile peace is broken for good. But memory has a way of softening edges. Day to day, the compromises did not arrive as thunderclaps. They came as choices. And in those years before Blackwater, those choices began to pull Arthur and John in opposite directions. even as both still swore they believed in Dutch from the very beginning. For Arthur, every close call became proof. When a train job went wrong and a guard reached for his gun, Dutch shot first, then spent the ride back through the night explaining why. He talked about protecting the family, about how civilization never hesitated to crush the poor. Arthur listened, bruised and exhausted, and decided Dutch was right. The risk, the blood, the fear, all of it meant Dutch was willing to pay the price for their shared dreams of freedom. He doubled down on his loyalty. After a botched stagecoach robbery where a civilian driver took a bullet, Dutch rode hard to drag an injured Bill out under fire. To Arthur, that was the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy. Dangerous, imperfect, but in the truest sense loyal. When doubts whispered, he smothered them with gratitude. Dutch had saved him, taught him, made him more than a common outlaw. How could a man like that be wrong? John saw the same nights unfold and heard something different. To him, the speeches started to repeat. Dutch would say the gang never killed unless forced, that they robbed only those who could afford it, that the old ways were dying and someone had to stand against the march of the world. Yet the body count crept higher, the lines blurred, and the apologies began to sound rehearsed. How many times could a job be unfortunate before it was simply who they were becoming? Arguments followed, usually in the quiet after the gun smoke cleared. John would question the wisdom of a route through a busy town, or the need to hit a train guarded by soldiers instead of a rich rancher's coach. Arthur pushed back, hard. He accused John of losing faith, of forgetting that from its humble beginnings the gang had always taken risks. Dutch, calm and smiling, would step between them, lay a hand on John's shoulder, and drown the moment in warm words about trust and patience. Favoritism slipped in almost unnoticed. Dutch praised Arthur's steadiness, his obedience under pressure, calling him the rock the family rested on. When John raised concerns, Dutch chuckled and called him hot-headed, a boy in need of seasoning. To the camp, it sounded harmless. To John, it planted a quiet resentment. Was caution weakness? Was questioning betrayal? This was a story of two sons drifting apart around the same father, one tightening his grip, the other slowly pulling away. And all the while, the world was changing faster than any of them understood. Soon, one reckless decision, one job meant to prove Dutch's greatness once and for all, would smash John's doubts straight into Dutch's pride, and leave scars on everyone who survived it. John's doubts and Dutch's pride were not clashing in a vacuum. They were colliding in a world that no longer fit the story Dutch had been telling since the very beginning. The world was changing. Railroads cut through the heart of the frontier, not as fragile lifelines but as iron arteries, carrying faster trains with armored cars, armed guards, and telegraphs waiting at every station. In the early days, a train robbery had been a daring interruption of civilization. Now, it was a flashing red signal that summoned lawmen from 3 counties before the gang could even count the money. Guns told the same tale. Where once a Winchester or a battered revolver had leveled the field between outlaw and deputy, now repeating rifles. Smokeless powder and factory-made ammunition meant more range, more accuracy, more death from farther away. The old ways were dying, not in a blaze of glory, but under the quiet efficiency of industry. Even in towns the gang passed through, telephones appeared in the offices of railroad men and oil speculators, tying distant cities together in invisible wires that moved faster than any horse. Hosea saw it with a conman's eye for odds. Every new wire, every improved rifle, every timeable pinned in a station house window tilted the table against them. A story of courage, cleverness, and willpower was becoming a story of numbers, logistics, and reach. Yet Dutch refused to accept that. To him, these inventions were just new masks on the same old enemy: government, capital, civilization pressing down on freedom. He stood at campfires and in safe houses and preached that no machine could outthink a determined man. No timeable could predict true courage. No corporation could buy the soul of someone who refused to be owned. In the truest sense, he doubled down on his philosophy. If the world grew more organized, then he would become more daring. If the noose tightened, then he would simply pull harder. But outside the camp, another narrative hardened. Newspapers that once romanticized outlaws now printed columns calling the Van Der Linde gang bandits, terrorists, murderers, Woodcut portraits and grainy photographs reduced Dutch, Hosea, Arthur, and John to crude faces on wanted posters, their bounties rising with every headline. The gang's internal myth of noble rebellion clashed with the printed reality of simple, dangerous criminals. Which story would the world remember? Hosea worried that Dutch no longer cared. From its humble beginnings, their dream had needed restraint as much as vision, but now Dutch seemed to believe his own legend, the living embodiment of his speeches about destiny and resistance. Each narrow escape reinforced the delusion that fate itself favored him, that odds and progress were just words other men hid behind. Quietly, Hosea started to fear something he dared not say aloud, that Dutch's greatest enemy was no longer the state, but his own certainty. And in the distance, that certainty was about to meet a new kind of opposition, organized, relentless, and backed by money and industry. Men who carried badges, telegraphs, and ledgers. Men who called themselves Pinkertons. The name sounded harmless enough. Not a government agency, not a marshal's office, just a company of detectives. But in the closing years of the century, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency became the living embodiment of a new kind of power in the West, private, organized, and utterly devoted to protecting capital from anyone who dared to threaten it. From its humble beginnings as a firm chasing train robbers and counterfeiters, the agency had evolved into something far more formidable. Railroads, banks, and industrial barons hired Pinkertons to guard their interests, break strikes, and hunt down outlaws who disrupted the flow of profit. These men carried badges, but answered to ledgers. They were not fighting for law, they were fighting for money. And that made them relentless. For the Van Der Linde gang, the first signs were almost invisible. A stranger in a town who seemed too curious about the number of horses at the hitching post. A bartender in Valentine who asked one too many questions about where the gang rode in from. A telegraph operator who watched them leave, then hurried back inside. At first, Dutch dismissed it as paranoia. The world was changing, and he expected more eyes, more whispers. But then the posses started riding smarter. Ambushes that should have been impossible suddenly appeared in their path. Lawmen who had never seen them up close somehow knew Dutch's height, Arthur's build, Hosea's limp. A simple bank job in a country town turned into a trap, with rifles already trained on the alley they always used to escape. Someone, somewhere, was mapping their habits. When Hosea traced the pattern back to Pinkerton inquiries, Dutch's fury was almost theatrical. To him, these men were proof of everything he had preached since the very beginning. The rich were frightened. Industrial civilization, hiding behind polite words and polished offices, was so terrified of free men that it would pay mercenaries to hunt them down. In Dutch's mind, the Pinkertons were not just enemies, they were validation, evidence that his philosophy had struck a nerve. He raged in campfires and safe houses, calling them dogs on a corporate leash, insisting that their presence meant the gang was winning. Was there any clearer sign that his dreams of freedom mattered than the railroads hiring an army to stop them? To back down now, he argued, would be to admit that the old ways were dying without a fight. Hosea's response was colder, and in the truest sense, more practical. Routes were changed. Old camps were burned to the ground, every trace of their passing turned to ash. He pushed Dutch to lay low, to scale back the flashier robberies, to favor small, quiet scores over grand gestures. Survival first, speeches second. That difference cut deep. Dutch heard caution as doubt, and doubt as betrayal. Hosea heard Dutch's defiance as pride, and pride as a danger to their family. Under the pressure of the Pinkertons, a story of loyalty and rebellion began to twist into one of suspicion and wounded egos. Each new inquiry, each near miss, forced Dutch toward a choice he despised: protect his people by shrinking his ambitions, or chase his grand philosophy and drag them into the line of fire. And the Pinkertons were only tightening their net. Their questions would soon have names attached. Milton, Ross, and their interest in Dutch would become something far more personal. But before Milton and Ross, before Guarma and Beaver Hollow, Dutch's name meant something very different inside that campfire circle. It meant safety. It meant that if the world was closing in, one man would ride the other way and drag his people back from the edge. One night in the early 1890s, a simple coach job out on the Heartlands Plain went wrong. The plan was textbook Dutch: scare the rich, spare the innocent, take enough to keep the gang fed without drawing too much heat. Arthur and a teenage John were posted on the ridge, while a younger recruit, barely more than a boy, handled the horses. Then the coach door flew open, and two off-duty deputies stepped out with shotguns instead of silk waistcoats. The first blast scattered the horses. The second pinned that boy behind a wheel, cut off from the others, choking on dust and gun smoke. Dutch could have run. Hosea shouted for a retreat, Javier was already peeling away, and the smart move, in the truest sense, was to vanish into the dark and write the whole thing off as bad luck. Instead, Dutch wheeled his horse around and charged back down the road, straight into the muzzle flashes. Arthur would remember the sound of Dutch's revolver more than the shouting. 3 measured shots, each one buying a heartbeat, each heartbeat buying that kid a chance to crawl. He threw himself out of the saddle, grabbed the boy by the collar, and half dragged, half carried him to cover, while bullets chewed splinters from the coach. For a moment, the famed philosopher of freedom was just a man cursing under his breath and refusing to let a lost soul die in the dirt. They escaped bloodied but breathing, the loot forgotten in the chaos, the night echoing with the deputies' furious calls. Back at camp, the story could have turned harsh. Dutch could have blamed the boy for spooking, blamed Arthur's lookout, blamed Hosea's information. That was how most outlaw leaders kept order, through fear, through humiliation, through carefully assigned guilt. Instead, Dutch gathered everyone and took the weight himself. He called it his miscalculation, his haste, his error. He told the gang the only crime that mattered was leaving a member behind, and that on that measure they had not failed. Later, away from the fire, he found the boy alone, hands still shaking. Dutch did not lecture him about courage. He talked about the world that was changing, about how the old ways were dying, about how men like them had to hold fast to their own form of civilization. Then he said something Arthur would never forget. "Your life is my responsibility. All of your lives are. That is my sacred duty." These were not empty words, not yet. From its humble beginnings, the Van Der Linde gang had been built on moments like that night on the Heartlands Road, on a leader who rode into danger rather than away from it. For Arthur, for John, for Bill and Javier, Dutch was the living embodiment of a story of loyalty and betrayal still waiting for its final act. How could they see a monster in the man who had once ridden back through gunfire to save them? And that is the cruel tension at the heart of Dutch's legend. The man who would one day walk Arthur into a massacre is the same man who once dragged a terrified boy out from under a hail of buckshot. The philosophy and the bravery came from the same place. The same burning belief that freedom could be carved out of a hostile world if the family held together. That belief would not vanish when the Pinkertons closed in. It would twist, harden, and turn against the very people it was sworn to protect. So when the noose began to tighten, when Blackwater loomed and St. Denis glittered on the horizon, the gang did not simply follow a madman. They followed the memory of the Dutch who had bled for them, the Dutch who had taken their sins onto his own shoulders. And that memory, more than any speech or plan, would keep them riding long after the danger had outgrown the dream. But memory can only hold a man in place for so long. The story of Dutch and Hosea, from its humble beginnings as 2 conmen arguing over marks in smoky back rooms, slowly became a story of one man speaking and another man being expected to nod. In the early years, the rhythm between them was almost ritual. A job began not with guns, but with talk. Dutch pacing, hands cutting the air, spinning a vision of freedom and easy money. Hosea sitting back, boots crossed, poking holes in every grand idea until what remained was lean, survivable, in the truest sense of the word. They would argue deep into the night over targets, over routes, over how much risk a family of outlaws could bear, and by dawn they usually met in the middle. Dutch brought the dream. Hosea brought the breaks. That balance did not vanish in an instant. It eroded. At first, Dutch simply arrived with plans that felt more finished than before. A train here, a bank there, a wealthy rancher who had it coming. Instead of, "What do you think?" it became, "Here is what we are doing." Hosea still questioned, still prodded. But more and more the decisions were presented as fate's accomplice, dressed in Dutch's philosophy about striking blows against civilization rather than as problems to be solved. Disagreements sharpened. Hosea warned against hitting a particular express train too often, knowing patterns drew Pinkertons. Dutch brushed him off with a smile, insisting their code and their mobility made them untouchable. Hosea argued for smaller halls and quieter roads, Dutch for bigger scores and grander gestures that would prove his world was right and the old ways were dying. On one job, Hosea wanted a backcountry route through the pines. Dutch overruled him, choosing a main road that showed the gang off to every ranch hand and drifter within 20 miles. When Hosea pressed him, Dutch's charm thinned, irritation flashing as he snapped that fear was how men ended up in chains. In private, the tone was very different. Around the campfire, under the weight of the stars, Hosea's conversations with Arthur turned from lessons to warnings. He admitted Dutch had begun to believe his own legend, to see himself as the living embodiment of resistance rather than a man who could bleed and fail. How long could their luck hold? How many times could Dutch walk them through gunfire and walk out smiling before the world changed its answer? Hosea could feel that the world was changing faster than Dutch's stories. The stakes were rising, the margins shrinking, and every success only fed Dutch's certainty that he could not be touched. And then came talk of a job that was different. Bigger, bolder, more dangerous than anything before. A job that would show, more clearly than ever, just how far Dutch was willing to push his people to keep the dream alive. That different job was the Blackwater Ferry, but the road to that disaster was paved with victories that felt, at the time, like destiny. This was the era when the Van Der Linde gang stopped thinking in towns and started thinking in territories, when Dutch's plans stretched across counties and railway lines, threading through the fragile order civilization was trying to impose. One of the clearest examples was the Great Valentine Annisburg operation, a story of precision, bravado, and the first real taste of overreach. Dutch and Hosea mapped it out over weeks, hit the bank in Valentine, draw law in Pinkerton's West, then, on the same day, have a second crew ambush a heavily insured payroll convoy bound for the mines near Annisburg. 2 towns, 2 scores, 1 orchestrated storm. From its humble beginnings as a ragged band of drifters, the gang had become, in the truest sense, a well-oiled outlaw machine. Arthur, John, Bill, and Karen walked into the Valentine Bank dressed as respectable townsfolk, while Javier and Charles waited with fresh horses on the edge of town. At the same time, Micah and Lenny rode north, timing their approach to the convoy by the train schedule Dutch had memorized. Doors were kicked in, vaults were opened, wagons were overturned. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos, and at the center of it all stood Dutch's philosophy that planning and nerve could still beat the encroaching weight of the modern world. Afterward, as they counted the take under a canvas of stars, Dutch told them what he always told them. This was it. Or if not this, then the next one. One more big score, and they would ride west, or north, or anywhere the maps ended, and freedom began. How many times had he painted that horizon? How many times had men and women who had nothing else chosen to believe him? The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but Dutch insisted there was still a place untouched by banks and railroads, if they could just buy their way there. Yet the cost of chasing that mirage kept rising. Rides grew longer, through harsher country, with more patrols on the roads and telegraph wires carrying their descriptions ahead of them. Every town they hit meant more Pinkertons on their trail, more wanted posters, more chances for a gun to misfire or a horse to stumble at the wrong moment. The payouts were bigger, yes, but so were the empty saddles when things went wrong. And in the middle of all that, the code began to bend. Hostages who once would have been calmed with Dutch's silver tongue were now shoved to the floor, pistol whipped when they hesitated. A bank clerk who reached for an alarm had his hand shot through instead of his wrist slapped away. Arthur noticed. So did Hosea. John saw it most clearly when Dutch snapped at a crying woman in Valentine, calling her collateral rather than ma'am. No one challenged him. Loyalty and fear held their tongues. But the man who had once been the living embodiment of their better outlaw dreams was slowly hardening into something else. All of this momentum, all of this pressure, funneled toward one job that was supposed to end the running. Not the ferry at Blackwater yet, but an earlier promise. A risky, sprawling robbery that would change John Marston's life forever. It would not just go wrong. It would leave scars on his body, his marriage, and his faith in Dutch that would never fully heal. The job itself was meant to be proof that Dutch still had it. A daring hit on a heavily guarded payroll, a clean escape through rough country, and enough money to push the gang toward those distant dreams of land and freedom. Instead, it became a story of loyalty tested, of betrayal implied, of families stretched to its breaking point long before Blackwater. The ambush went well enough at the start. Arthur, John, Javier, Bill, and the others struck hard and fast, Dutch directing them with the old confidence, Hosea watching the flanks. But the world was changing, and the Pinkertons were learning. The law came down on them quicker than expected, rifles cracking from the tree line, horses screaming, the sky turning to smoke and dust. In the chaos of the retreat, John's horse was shot out from under him. He went down hard, rolled off the trail, and vanished into the brush, wounded and separated as the rest of the gang thundered past. For a moment, Dutch did what he had always done from the very beginning. He slowed, half turning in the saddle, searching the haze for his adopted son. Once, he had ridden back into gunfire for Arthur, for Hosea, for nameless hangers on who barely pulled their weight. He had been, in the truest sense, the living embodiment of his own philosophy, no one left behind, not ever. But now, the gunfire was heavier, the stakes higher, and the old ways were dying. Back at camp, the argument began almost before the horses stopped. Arthur wanted to turn around immediately. Javier backed him, insisting John was tough, but not invincible. Abigail, holding Jack close, demanded they ride out before dark. Around the fire, voices clashed, family against survival, ideals against cold arithmetic. Dutch listened, pacing, his face harder than it had been in those more idealistic years. Then he drew the line. They had barely escaped. The Pinkertons would be combing the area. To ride back would be to risk everyone, he argued, to throw away the many for the one. He spoke of responsibility, of leadership, of the future. But to Arthur, hearing those words, it sounded less like courage and more like retreat. The man who once mocked civilization's cruelty was suddenly using its logic. Arthur's heartbreak in that moment was quiet but deep. He saw Hosea's troubled gaze, saw Abigail crumble, saw Jack stare at the ground as if trying not to understand. This was not just a tactical decision. It was a crack in the story Dutch had told them all from its humble beginnings. Family first. No exceptions. Now there was an exception. John did not die out there. Half-conscious, bleeding, he dragged himself through rock and snow, hid from searching riders, and stole what he needed from distant homesteads. A wounded outlaw limping through a hostile world, he survived on stubbornness and the bitter realization that Dutch's protection had limits. In those lonely nights, a lesson set like bone, in the end, he could rely on himself, maybe on Arthur, but not on promises. When John finally staggered back into camp days later, gaunt and scarred, there was relief, there was anger, and there was something else. A distance. His loyalty had not vanished, but it had changed shape, hardening into a quiet, watchful bitterness. Dutch's image as infallible protector had been chipped, and that fracture would echo years later on snowy mountainsides and in burning towns. The first great betrayal had already happened. The rest was only a matter of time. That fracture did not shatter Arthur's faith overnight. It did something quieter, and in the truest sense, more dangerous. It left him suspended between the man Dutch had been and the man Dutch was becoming, between memory and reality, between the father he worshipped and the father he was beginning to doubt. John's abandonment in the snow became the fault line running through that tension. Arthur had watched John ride away from Coulter, had heard Dutch's cold dismissal when the question of going back arose, and he had stayed silent. On the surface, he told himself John had chosen his path, that the gang came first, that Dutch knew best. Underneath, the guilt gnawed. Why had he not argued harder? Why had he not been the one to insist, to saddle a horse, to ride out into the blizzard for the man he once called brother? In that storm of doubt, Hosea stepped in. One night, when the camp had gone mostly quiet and the wind outside the cabin walls had softened to a dull moan, Hosea found Arthur sitting alone, staring into the fire as if it might offer an answer. Hosea did not start with lectures or grand speeches. He started with a simple truth. Dutch had been wrong to leave John. The words hung there, heavy and almost unthinkable. From its humble beginnings, the gang had treated Dutch's judgment as law. Hearing Hosea question it at all felt like the ground shifting. But Hosea did not stay on the attack. He leaned on the bigger picture, on the story of survival they were still trying to write. Dutch was under pressure, the world was changing, The old ways were dying, and men made mistakes when they were hunted and cold. Hosea urged Arthur to stay steady, to keep the family together, to remember that one bad decision did not erase a lifetime of rescues, lessons, and sacrifices. The message was clear: acknowledge the flaw, but do not let it break the dream. Arthur, ever the loyal son, took that and turned the blade inward. If John had been left, perhaps Arthur had failed as Dutch's right hand. If Dutch had stumbled, perhaps Arthur had not supported him well enough, had not anticipated, had not done the work a true lieutenant should do. Any failure became his weakness, not Dutch's misjudgment. In a world built on Dutch's philosophy, questioning the leader felt like betraying the family itself. That dynamic kept Dutch's myth intact in Arthur's mind. Hosea, the living embodiment of pragmatism, saw more clearly. He began, quietly, to prepare himself for a day when someone might have to stand up to Dutch rather than stand beside him. Arthur was not ready for that story yet. His dreams of freedom still wore Dutch's face, and his refusal to see that face clearly now would make the eventual reckoning not just painful, but catastrophic. The next cracks in that illusion were already on their way. Those cracks did not appear in a single gunshot or a single argument. They appeared in the quiet space between Dutch's speeches and his decisions, in the widening distance between the man around the campfire and the man in the smoke of a robbery gone wrong. Dutch kept talking the way he always had. Around the fire at Horseshoe Overlook or Clemens Point, he still painted the gang as the living embodiment of freedom in a world closing in. He spoke of honor, of protecting the weak, of refusing to kneel to a civilization built on exploitation. To the newest members, it still sounded in the truest sense like a story of noble outlaws standing against a corrupt order. But the jobs were changing. The targets grew uglier, the risks higher, the collateral damage harder to ignore. A bank guard shot in the back when he reached for an alarm. A maid trampled in the chaos of a St. Denis getaway. A stagecoach overturned on a mountain road, killing a passenger Dutch had never meant to harm. Each time, the gang looked to Dutch. Each time, he had an answer. Regrettable, he would say, voice low and grave, but necessary. The world was changing, he insisted, and the old ways were dying. If they did not strike hard, if they did not take what they could, the government and its companies would grind them all into dust. It was a familiar philosophy, the same words from its humble beginnings, but now they sat over fresh graves. Arthur felt the dissonance first as a dull ache rather than a revelation. He would hear Dutch promise that they did not hurt innocents, then ride out the next day and watch him fire into a crowd to clear a path. He would listen to Dutch swear that family came before profit, then see him leave wounded men behind when the law closed in. The man who taught Arthur to read and think now seemed to be arguing against his own lessons. John, always more cynical, stopped pretending. Around camp, he began to mutter that Dutch's talk of freedom sounded real nice until someone else had to pay the price. When Dutch dismissed another dead civilian as the cost of progress, John called it hypocrisy to his face. Dutch bristled, eyes hardening, the father hearing a son's betrayal. Arthur snapped at John in turn, defending Dutch out of habit and loyalty, even as a small, unwelcome part of him wondered who was actually seeing the world clearly. This tension became its own silent member of the gang, riding with them from job to job, sitting between Dutch's promises and his plans. Hosea sensed it, tried to nudge Dutch back toward restraint, toward the careful schemes of the early days. But a story of dreams and delusions was already in motion, and the next loss would not be collateral. The fate of Hosea Matthews would tear away one of Dutch's last remaining restraints, and when that happened, the gap between his rhetoric and reality would become a chasm no one could cross. Hosea could feel it long before anyone dared to name it. The balance was slipping. The careful dance that had defined the gang from its humble beginnings was giving way to a march toward open war with the world. He started confronting Dutch more directly, not in front of the whole camp at first, but in those quiet moments over a map, a bottle, and the glow of the fire. He would tap a finger against the sprawling plans for St. Denis, for Braithwaite and Grey feuds, for trains and banks and trolleys, and say, almost gently, that this was not who they had been. They had once been con men in the truest sense, living on wit and timing, slipping in and out of civilization without leaving bodies in the street. Now the risks were larger, the guns louder, the enemies far more organized. Dutch did not like what he heard. Each warning sounded to him less like concern and more like accusation. When Hosea suggested that Blackwater should have been the lesson, not the prologue, Dutch's jaw tightened. When Hosea argued that the world was changing faster than their old tricks could adapt, Dutch heard only doubt in his philosophy. Was Hosea losing his nerve? Had grief and age hollowed out the man who once sold fake bonds with a grin and a flourish? The conversations grew sharper. Dutch began to accuse Hosea, sometimes with a smile that did not reach his eyes, of no longer believing in the dream, of betrayal wrapped in caution. He would talk about freedom, about destiny, about being the living embodiment of resistance to a rigged system, and any suggestion of restraint felt to him like surrender. The more Hosea tried to rein him in, the more Dutch pulled away, convinced that only he still saw the path clearly. So Hosea turned, quietly, to Arthur. He would pull him aside on hunting trips, or when they rode into town under the pretense of buying provisions. He urged him to think for himself, to look at what Dutch did, not just what Dutch said. Was every risk still for the family, or were some for Dutch's pride? Was every speech about loyalty, or about keeping the legend of Dutch Van Der Linde alive? These were not accusations. They were questions meant to wake a conscience already stirring. In those moments, the sadness in Hosea's eyes said more than his words. He watched the man he loved like a brother grow more rigid, more paranoid, more obsessed with his own myth. The old ways were dying, and instead of bending, Dutch was hardening into the very thing he claimed to despise. Hosea understood the danger in that better than anyone. He also understood one more, darker truth. When the day finally came that he was removed from the board, Dutch's worst impulses would have no counterweight. And that day was closer than anyone in camp dared imagine. Hosea could see the storm coming. The rest of the camp only felt the wind change. At first it was nothing dramatic, nothing that would make a man grab his saddle and ride for a new life. It was smaller than that, quieter than that. It was a story of doubts whispered over coffee pots and dying campfires. Around the wagons, the minor voices in the gang began to fray at the edges. Pearson grumbled that Dutch kept them in one spot too long, that the supply runs were getting riskier for less return. Uncle, between naps and half-finished chores, muttered that the routes Dutch chose made no sense, that the law always seemed to know which road they were on. Even Bill Williamson, who had once been the living embodiment of blunt, unquestioning muscle, started asking why they were robbing this train, hitting that town, trusting this contact. The questions rarely went upward, but they circulated sideways, passed from hand to hand like contraband. John Marston felt it first in his bones. The eager boy from the very beginning, the one who would ride at Dutch's side without hesitation, started to lag behind. When Dutch called for volunteers, John still stepped forward, but the step was slower, the glance sharper. Orders that once earned an instant sure now met with a half smile, a sarcastic remark, or worse, a flat silence. He would clean his gun a little longer before saddling up. He would ask, almost casually, if Dutch had really thought this plan through. Was this still about freedom, or just about Dutch proving he was right? Arthur noticed that change, and something in himself as well. He had spent years repeating Dutch's words back to the others, preaching the philosophy of the gang as if it were scripture. Now, every so often, he caught himself pausing before he spoke. A line about civilization crushing the poor would stop on his tongue. A promise that this next score would finally set the family free would ring hollow in his own ears. For a heartbeat, he felt the flicker of doubt. Then he smothered it, in the truest sense, for the sake of unity, for the memory of the man who had taken a lost soul off the streets and given him a name. Dutch felt it too. He always did. But introspection had never been his refuge. Instead of looking inward, he raised his voice. The speeches grew longer, the promises richer, the gestures grander. Around each new campfire, he painted visions of a world beyond the reach of the law, beyond the reach of railroads and barbed wire. The world was changing, he said, but they would carve out one last place where the old ways were dying everywhere except with them. It was tragic irony in motion. The more he sensed his grip loosening, the tighter he clung to the very behaviors that pushed his people away. Every failed plan demanded a bigger one. Every murmur of doubt demanded a louder declaration of loyalty. And with each raised toast, each swelling speech, the distance between Dutch's dreams and the gang's reality widened, setting the stage for the moment when words would no longer be enough, and blood would have to fill the gap. But before the speeches turned empty, before the blood had to fill that widening gap, there was another Dutch, a man whose words did not just cover over violence, but genuinely tried to point toward something better. To remember the fall, the story must pause and remember the height. In the very beginning, Dutch Van Der Linde was not simply a gang leader. He was a teacher. Around campfires in the Grizzlies, or under lantern light in some half-frozen cabin, he sat with Arthur and John, a tattered book in his hands, forcing two street-raised boys to sound out letters. The scenes are quiet, almost domestic. Dutch correcting Arthur's pronunciation. Dutch making John read passages about freedom and civilization, then demanding he explain them. It was a strange kind of classroom, built on stolen money and stolen time, but in the truest sense, it was education. Those lessons mattered. They told Arthur and John that they were not just hired guns, not just muscle for a con man with grand ideas. Dutch filled their heads with stories of philosophers and revolutionaries, of men who challenged empires and refused to bow. He framed their outlaw life as part of that tradition, a story of resistance rather than petty crime. Was it self-serving? Of course, but it also gave two lost souls a language to dream in, a way to imagine that their lives could be more than running and killing. From its humble beginnings, the gang's code reflected that idealistic pose. Dutch turned down work that would have made them rich, because it violated the image of themselves he clung to. Easy jobs involving stagecoaches full of migrant families were rejected. Contracts from men tied to the worst industrial barons were dismissed with contempt. Dutch would rob a railroad magnate, but not the poor workers paid by the day. He would scheme against a corrupt politician, but refused to be muscle for a man he considered truly evil. There were lines he would not cross, or at least claimed he would not. And when his people were hurt in those early years, the mask did not have to crack to show grief. The grief was the mask. When Annabelle fell to Colm O'Driscoll's bullet, Dutch's rage was not yet the cold, theatrical fury of Beaver Hollow. It was raw and almost childlike. A man howling at a world that kept taking his family. When a lesser member died in some botched holdup, Dutch drank in silence, then rode out himself to make it right. Their lives mattered to him then. Or he believed they did. This is where the pattern interrupts the easy reading of Dutch as a simple villain. His ideals were not entirely fake. For a long time, he truly believed in the philosophy he preached, even if his ego sat coiled at the center of it. He was the living embodiment of a paradox, a man who wanted freedom and family, yet needed to be the sun they orbited. So the haunting question lingers over every campfire memory and every tender lesson in reading. Did Dutch change as the world was changing and the old ways were dying? Or did time and pressure merely give him more chances to become the man he always really was? That question does not stay abstract for Arthur Morgan. It becomes a slow, painful answer written in blood, bad decisions, and the way Dutch starts walking into a room. At first, the changes are almost invisible. A train hit here, a stagecoach there, another town shaken down in the name of freedom. But Arthur begins to notice what Hosea notices. Dutch is no longer picking the safest road. He is picking the loudest. A simple robbery turns into a spectacle. A clean escape becomes a standoff in the street. And every plan needs a speech to justify the risk. The gang is supposed to be hiding, yet Dutch keeps choosing jobs that announce their presence to the entire world. He remembers the very beginning, when a younger Dutch would abandon a score the moment a child cried or a civilian reached for a gun in panic. Now, that same man insists on pushing through Pinkerton pressure, insisting that boldness is the only answer. In Rhodes, in Valentine, in the shadow of Blackwater's disaster, Arthur sees a pattern. Dutch is gambling with lives to prove a philosophy. Survival is no longer the only goal. Being right is. Arthur carries these realizations in silence for a long time. Around the campfire, he watches Dutch pace and rant about civilization and betrayal, about dreams and delusions, and he quietly compares the preacher on the crate to the teacher who once sat beside him with a tattered book. The contrast cuts deep. The man who taught him to read now barely listens. The man who said family comes first now drags that family into gunfire to satisfy pride. When Arthur finally tests his doubts, he expects a fight. He goes to Hosea in the quieter hours, half defensive, half ashamed, and admits that Dutch feels different. Hosea does not argue. He does not scold. He only sighs. That weary, knowing sigh, and says that the world was changing, that the old ways were dying, and that Dutch is taking it harder than anyone. Others echo it in smaller ways. Charles questions the bloodshed. Sadie bristles at Dutch's empty reassurances. Even Javier, ever loyal, has a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Arthur realizes he is not the only one seeing through the smoke. Yet love makes the awakening agony. Dutch is not just a leader. He is the living embodiment of Arthur's entire life, from its humble beginnings as a hungry street thief to an outlaw with a cause. So Arthur clings to every scrap of the old Dutch he can find, a rescued camp member, a rare moment of tenderness with Jack, a plan that for once goes off without unnecessary killing. Each small mercy becomes proof that the man he believed in is still in there, buried beneath the anger and the fear. But beneath that fragile hope, something fundamental has shifted. Arthur no longer assumes Dutch is right, he waits to be convinced. And as the jobs grow more desperate, as Pinkertons close in and money slips through their fingers, that hesitation becomes deadly. The stage is nearly set for the tragedies to come. And now the audience understands the cruelest part of this story of loyalty and betrayal. The collapse of the gang will begin inside Arthur's heart, just as the walls of the new century close around them all. John had always been the skeptic, the one who rolled his eyes at Dutch's speeches while still riding along. Now, as the money vanished and the Pinkertons closed in, that skepticism stopped being a quirk and started sounding like prophecy. The story of Dutch's fall was no longer just unfolding in Arthur's conscience. It was being dragged into the open by John's questions. Around the campfire, in planning meetings, even in the middle of muddy roads on the way to another doomed score, John began to challenge Dutch in the truest sense. He asked where the money was really going, what the true endgame was, when this one last job would finally mean freedom instead of another flight into the wilderness. Was Dutch actually planning for the gang's retirement, or just chasing a dream he could never afford to let end? Dutch, who had once prided himself on debate and philosophy, did not meet those questions with arguments. He met them with wounded pride. He called John ungrateful, reminded him of the days when he was a half-wild teenager Dutch had dragged in from the cold. He contrasted him, again and again, with Arthur, the living embodiment of loyalty in Dutch's eyes. Arthur believed. Arthur understood. Arthur did not question the man who had raised him, or so Dutch insisted. This turned John and Arthur against each other in quiet, painful ways. In the woods after a botched job, John would point at a dead civilian and ask Arthur when "we don't kill innocents" had stopped meaning anything. In camp, he would mutter about Blackwater, about Hosea's warnings, about Dutch walking away from the trolley station as if the bodies were just scenery. Arthur, still clinging to the Dutch from its humble beginnings, tried to defend him, tried to say it was all part of a larger plan. But each defense rang thinner, each excuse more hollow. Their arguments carried the weight of years. Arthur would remind John of the times Dutch had risked his life to save them, of the books he had pressed into their hands, of the old speeches about civilization crushing the free man. John would answer with newer memories, Dutch leaving him to rot after Blackwater, Dutch trusting Micah over family, Dutch talking about Tahiti while children went hungry. Between idealism and reality, between freedom and civilization, a gulf had opened that words could not close. From the outside, it might have looked like youthful rebellion all over again, the same hot-headed boy pushing back against a father figure. But the world was changing, the old ways were dying, and John's doubts no longer felt adolescent. They felt clear-eyed, almost cold. He was seeing not the man Dutch had been at the very beginning, but the man he was becoming, erratic, paranoid, enthralled by his own rhetoric. And somewhere ahead, just past these arguments and glances and half-finished threats, waited the moment that would break them. The day John would finally walk away, and Dutch Van Der Linde would decide that this, more than the Pinkertons or progress or fate, was the unforgivable betrayal. That reckoning was coming, and when it arrived, nothing in the gang's long, bloody story would ever be the same again. For a little while, after all those arguments and half-spoken threats, the gang found something that almost felt peaceful. Not safe, not secure, but steady. A camp on the edge of history where the laughter at night could almost drown out the sound of the world closing in. The fires burned bright, pots of stew bubbled, and someone was always tuning a guitar or humming a hymn off key. Children chased each other between wagons. Men sharpened knives, cleaned rifles, played cards. Women washed clothes, told stories, traded gossip about the nearest town. On the surface, it was the living embodiment of Dutch's dream, an outlaw family, self-sufficient, free, answering to no one. But under the music and the jokes, there was that quiet, constant awareness that this could not last. The world was changing, and every man and woman in that camp could feel it in their bones. Dutch refused to let that feeling take root. He walked the grounds with his coat flaring behind him, tipping his hat, offering a kind word, a shared cigarette, a promise. At night, he stood by the main fire and gave those speeches that had once built this gang from its humble beginnings. He talked about freedom and civilization, about the corrupt government and the railroads and the oil men. He insisted that they were not criminals, but a story of resistance, in the truest sense, against a rigged world. Yet even as he spoke, Pinkertons were tightening their net, telegraphs were humming with their names, and the old ways were dying faster than any of them could run. Arthur heard the speeches, nodded along, and then went back to his journal. He wrote out on collections, hunted game, taught Jack to fish, and tried to pretend that these routines meant something permanent. John, back in camp after his own disappearance, hovered at the edge of the firelight, half in and half out, holding Abigail and Jack close, as if he already knew this family could not protect them forever. They were men caught between dreams and delusions, between loyalty and the quiet knowledge that this life ended one of two ways, a noose or a bullet. How long could they keep pretending otherwise? Around them, others clung to habit. Javier played guitar. Bill drank and boasted. Charles hunted and brought in meat that kept everyone alive. Susan enforced order. On any given evening, it could have passed for the very beginning of their story, when they were younger and the law felt far away. That was the tragedy. It all looked so familiar, and yet everything had already changed. Only Hosea seemed to move through camp as if he were walking through the last act of a play he had already seen. He sat with Dutch, shared plans, talked about one last score and a little cottage somewhere quiet, but his eyes gave him away. He watched the children a bit longer. He lingered over his pipe, stared into the fire as if reading the future in the coals. Hosea had always believed in Dutch's philosophy, but now he believed in consequences more. He knew that a man could outrun the law, but not time and not himself. In those evenings, Dutch was still there, the teacher, the idealistic outlaw, the man who once pulled Arthur and John out of the mud and gave them a name. Yet something darker had taken root beside him, a shadow that stretched a little longer with each setback, each betrayal, each reminder that civilization was winning. The camp was alive with song and motion, but it stood on borrowed time, balanced on the thin line between legend and collapse. Everyone could feel that something was coming. The question was not if, but when, and how much blood the final chapter would demand. Everyone could feel that something was coming. But there was a moment, brief and almost gentle, when something else was possible. Before Guarma, before Beaver Hollow, before the name Dutch Van Der Linde became a warning, there was a quiet fork in the road where the story could have ended in peace instead of blood. It came after one of the gang's brightest stretches, when the jobs were clean. The takes were good, and the Pinkertons were still a distant threat rather than a constant shadow. A successful train out in the Grizzlies, a stage in Lemoyne, a few well-planned scores against the rich and corrupt who had grown fat on railroad money and government contracts. For a brief season, the camp was full, the coffers were heavy, and no one went to sleep hungry or afraid. From its humble beginnings, this was the dream made real: freedom, family, and enough cash to imagine a future. Hosea saw that opening first. He always did. Sitting by the fire with Dutch, ledger in hand, he laid it out in the plain, unromantic language Dutch hated but needed. They had money. They had time. They had a chance. Buy land in New Austin or up in the Grizzlies. A ranch, a small farm, a boarding house in some half-built town where the world was changing slower than the rest. This is it, Dutch, Hosea told him. This is the moment. Walk away now, and the story ends with all of us alive. For a while, Dutch listened. Really listened. He talked about a valley he had seen once, ringed with pines, where the snow melted into a clear stream and the nearest telegraph wire was a week's ride away. He spoke of a house with a library, of Arthur and John raising their own families, of Jack learning to read poetry instead of wanted posters. In the truest sense, he sounded less like an outlaw and more like a schoolteacher again, the living embodiment of the idealistic man he had been at the very beginning. He even sketched it out, rough plans on the back of old bounty notices. A barn here, a main house there, a corral, a smokehouse. Hosea watched his friend's hands move, saw the boy from the Civil War years dreaming of a world without uniforms or chains. For one night, Dutch's philosophy bent toward rest instead of rebellion. Then the pattern broke. A rumor reached camp of one more score, one more train heavy with government bonds, one more chance to humiliate the civilization he despised. The old ways were dying, he said, and if they did not strike now, they would be crushed or forgotten. Was he protecting his family or defending his pride? In the end, Dutch folded the sketches away and chose motion over mercy. He promised Hosea there would be time to buy that land after this last job, after this final proof that his way of living still meant something in a world that wanted him gone. It was a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, condensed into a single decision. The tragedy is not that Dutch fell. The tragedy is that he walked past the exit with his eyes open, again and again, dragging everyone who loved him further down the road he had chosen. And the next step on that road would make turning back almost impossible. That road did not suddenly twist into madness at Guarma or Beaver Hollow. It bent slowly, almost imperceptibly, as Dutch began to see enemies in every shadow and hear betrayal in every silence. The world was changing, and Dutch could feel it in his bones. Railroads cut through the wilderness, telegraph lines stitched distant towns together, Pinkertons arrived faster after every job. What had once been a story of outlaws dancing just ahead of civilization became, in his mind, a story of civilization hunting them with inhuman precision. A botched tip in Valentine? Proof that the town was bought and paid for. A posse arriving too quickly after a robbery on the Heartland's tracks? Evidence, to Dutch, of a coordinated conspiracy rather than simple progress. From its humble beginnings, the gang had lived on risk. Plans failed. Jobs went sideways. For years, Dutch and Hosea had treated those failures as part of the life, lessons to be folded into the philosophy and tried again. Now, each setback hardened into accusation. A rancher who refused to talk became a spy. A contact who backed out of a deal became a traitor. When an old associate in Blackwater warned that the law was tightening, Dutch did not hear concern. He heard betrayal. His speeches changed with him. Once, around the fire, he spoke of freedom and family, of carving out a place where lost souls could be more than the world allowed. He quoted books, talked about the old ways dying, but promised they would build something new in the truest sense. Gradually, that cadence remained while the content rotted. The enemies grew larger, more abstract, more omnipresent. No longer just greedy rail barons or corrupt sheriffs, but a nameless they that controlled banks, newspapers, courts, and even the weather of their lives. It was apocalyptic rhetoric from a man who once preached possibility. Now he promised storms. He spoke of persecution, of being hunted for daring to dream, of a system that would never permit men such as them to live free. Was there truth in it? Of course. But truth, bent by fear, became something closer to delusion. Some drank it in. Newer members, men like Bill and Javier, heard a leader under siege and felt honored to stand at his side. To them, Dutch was the living embodiment of resistance, a prophet railing against a poisoned civilization that had no place for men of courage. The more he talked about enemies closing in, the more essential they felt. For others, the chill set in. Hosea watched the man he loved as a brother turn every question into an insult. Arthur noticed that Dutch listened less and lectured more. John, already wrestling with his own doubts and failures, heard in Dutch's words not comfort, but a demand for blind loyalty. Around those same campfires, the pauses after Dutch's speeches grew longer, heavier. This was not yet the Dutch who would abandon men in a jungle or whisper to Micah in the dark. But the seeds were there, already sprouting, already twisting toward the Dutch of Guarma and Beaver Hollow, where paranoia would no longer be a crack in the foundation, but the entire house. Those seeds finally broke the surface in blood. The moment came not in some grand showdown, but in a cramped Saint Denis alley, choked with gun smoke and screams Dutch once would have called unnecessary. The job was simple in theory: snatch Angelo Bronte from his mansion, trade one parasite of civilization for information and leverage. Dutch sold it as a righteous act, punishing a man who preyed on the poor. But when Bronte ended up bound on a boat in the bayou, surrounded by men Dutch called family, the tone shifted. Dutch's speech was no longer about freedom or justice. It was about humiliation. It was about making a point. When Dutch shoved Bronte's head under the water and held it there, smiling through gritted teeth, something broke in Arthur. This was not the living embodiment of rebellion he had followed from its humble beginnings. This was a man drowning a helpless enemy for sport, while the gang watched in stunned silence. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but this was not progress, and it was not principle. It was cruelty. Arthur's reaction was immediate and visceral. He dragged Dutch back, voice rough, eyes wide with a disgust he could not swallow. The anger was not at the violence alone, but at the betrayal of a philosophy he had built his life around. Dutch snapped at him, offended that anyone would question him in front of the gang, yet for a heartbeat, the mask slipped, and the wounded outrage looked almost childish. How dare his most loyal son flinch now? The confrontation that followed was quiet, but it cut deeper than any shouted argument. Later, back at camp, Arthur pressed him. Why kill the man that way? Why risk everything for a petty display? Dutch answered with the old lines about loyalty and destiny, about wolves and lambs, about how men like Bronte would never stop hunting them. Then came the turn. He reminded Arthur of all the times he had been saved, all the times Dutch had chosen him over an easier road. Was this how Arthur repaid that loyalty? It was manipulation in the truest sense, wrapped in the language of family. Once, that would have worked. This time, the words rang hollow. Arthur felt the distance, felt the space opening between what Dutch said and what Dutch did. For the first time since the very beginning, he judged the act not by Dutch's code, but by his own emerging sense of right and wrong. From that night on, every order sounded different. Every plan was measured not just against survival, but against a question Arthur could no longer silence. At what point does loyalty become its own betrayal? That question would lead him toward an unthinkable choice, toward the day he would risk everything to stop Dutch himself. And when that day came, the man standing in Arthur's sights would not be a stranger. He would be the same man from the boat, hand on another drowning soul. The same man from the boat would face another drowning soul long before Arthur drew a gun on him. That soul was John Marston, and his first escape from Dutch's orbit was a story of freedom grasped, rejected, and weaponized. John's departure did not come in a single argument or a single night. It built slowly, through the long years after Jack was born, as the world was changing and the gang's raids grew bloodier, sloppier, harder to justify even under Dutch's eloquent speeches. John had always been more restless than Arthur, more willing to test the boundaries of Dutch's philosophy, and Abigail's presence only sharpened that edge. What good was an idealistic dream of family if that family could not keep a child safe? He watched the Pinkertons grow bolder. He watched Dutch take bigger risks to prove the old ways were dying, only because men like him refused to kneel. He watched Hosea grow tired. Somewhere in those years, the campfire sermons stopped sounding like liberation and started sounding like excuses. So John did the unthinkable. He walked away. He tried to build something of his own, in the truest sense, with Abigail and Jack, chasing a quieter life that did not begin and end with a gun. For Dutch, it was not just a loss. It was a betrayal. John was not merely a gun hand. He was the living embodiment of Dutch's claim that the gang could save lost souls, turn outlaws into men with purpose. When John left, Dutch did not see a young father trying to protect his family from civilization's noose. He saw his own philosophy being put on trial and found wanting. If John could choose a cabin and a fence over the open road, what did that say about everything Dutch had preached from the very beginning? Around the camp, Dutch's talk of John swung like a pendulum. On some nights, he reminisced about the boy they had taken in, the wild teenager he had taught to read, the son who had ridden into gunfire for him. On others, his voice went hard and cold, dismissing John as ungrateful, weak, corrupted by domestic comforts. Then there were nights when he barely mentioned John at all, insisting the gang was stronger, purer without him, as if saying it often enough would make it true. Nostalgia, anger, denial, all of it revealed how much he needed his sons to reflect him back as a hero. John's absence confirmed every fear that had been gnawing at Dutch since Blackwater and before. The world was changing, stealing his people one by one, not just with bullets and prisons, but with promises of land, wages, and legal names. If John could be pulled away, who was next? Arthur? Javier? The paranoia that would later bloom at Guarma and Beaver Hollow was already taking root, driving Dutch to clutch more tightly at those who remained, to test their loyalty with ever more reckless schemes. So when John finally came back, dragged half dead into the snow at Coulter, he did not return to the man from its humble beginnings. He returned to a leader already cracking under the strain of loss and betrayal, a man whose need for control would collide with Arthur's illness and the slow, merciless collapse of the Van Der Linde dream. John came back to a leader cracking under pressure, but Arthur did not let go of the man he remembered overnight. He could not. For Arthur, Dutch was not just a failing general, he was the living embodiment of a promise made to a scared boy on the side of a road. From the very beginning, Dutch had been more than an outlaw with a gun. Around campfires and in quiet moments, he had been a teacher, a philosopher, a father in the truest sense. He sat with Arthur over tattered books, tracing words with a calloused finger, turning a barely literate street thief into a man who could read speeches and question the world. He talked about freedom, about civilization crushing the poor, about building a family that answered to no one. Those memories were not theories to Arthur. They were the reason he was still alive. There were the rescues too, Dutch dragging him out of botched robberies, standing between Arthur and a sheriff's gun, insisting, again and again, that no one got left behind. When Dutch said, "I gave you all the tools, now you gotta use them," it was not empty rhetoric. It was a story of years spent shaping Arthur's mind and skills, from its humble beginnings in small-town cons to daring train jobs that seemed almost noble in their targets. Even in 1899, with the world closing in and the old ways were dying, there were flashes of that man. After Coulter, when a sick child cried in camp, Dutch would lower his voice, promise that they would find somewhere warm, somewhere safe, and for a heartbeat his eyes softened. In St. Denis, after barking orders and spinning grand plans, he would share a cigarette with Arthur on a balcony, confessing that he felt the world was changing too fast, that he was tired. Once, in the murk of Shady Bell, Arthur caught him quietly straightening Hosea's old books, fingers lingering on the covers as if touching a grave. These small mercies mattered. A kind word to Jack, a rare apology to Abigail, a hand on Arthur's shoulder before a dangerous ride. They gave Arthur just enough reason to believe that the old Dutch was buried, not gone. How could he walk away from the man who had saved him from becoming just another lost soul on a prison wagon? That hope was Arthur's strength. It kept him compassionate, loyal, unwilling to abandon a wounded man even when betrayal seemed inevitable. It was also his weakness. It kept him riding into one more town, one more heist, one more speech about dreams and destiny, long after the evidence screamed that those dreams were curdling into delusions. This is what makes Dutch's arc more than a tale of simple villainy. A tyrant is easy to hate, a fallen father is harder. Dutch was a man Arthur loved, a man who once believed his own rhetoric about freedom and family, and then slowly lost himself trying to outrun a civilization he despised. Remembering that man prepares the ground for what comes next. Because the collapse of the Van Der Linde gang is not just about bullets and betrayals. It is about watching that fragile hope die, one compromise, one body, one broken promise at a time. How many chances can a leader waste before even the most loyal son finally lets go? Those wasted chances finally come due in blood. All the speeches, all the promises, all the talk of freedom and family harden into a single, brutal truth. There is a bill to be paid, and the Van Der Linde gang pays it one body at a time. The late-game timeline is a chain of confrontations that feel less like new events and more like debts maturing. The ambush at Beaver Hollow, the Pinkertons pouring into the trees, is the natural end of years spent taunting civilization. Micah's whispered betrayals, the quiet meetings in the shadows, turn into open gunfire as the camp splits down the middle. Men who once rode together through blizzards and dust storms now point guns across the fire, and the last stands that follow feel less heroic and more inevitable. This is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, finally stripped of romance. In those moments, Dutch's choices become the dark mirror of his early heroism. Where he once rode back into danger to pull a wounded man onto his horse, he now rides away, leaving John trapped on the rooftops of Saint Denis and, later, presumed dead in the chaos. Where he once hunted O'Driscolls to avenge Annabelle, he now trusts Micah Bell, the living embodiment of everything he used to despise. And where he once pulled Arthur off the streets as a lost soul worth saving, he now walks Arthur straight into near-certain death on that final climb, more concerned with his own wounded philosophy than the sun at his side. The camp itself dies before most of its members do. The arguments at Beaver Hollow, the whispered doubts, the sudden disappearances turn Dutch's dream from its humble beginnings as a wandering family into a paranoid fortress. Charles and Sadie peel away to pursue their own paths. Bill and Javier cling to Dutch's shadow, unable or unwilling to admit the old ways were dying. Others fall in crossfires that mean nothing to the grand speeches they once believed in. The firelight that once meant safety now only illuminates betrayal. In the middle of that collapse, Arthur and John's story resolves in action, not in words. Arthur turns his back on the man who raised him and rides to pull John out, not for Dutch's dream, but for Abigail and Jack, for a quieter life beyond the gun. In the truest sense, he passes the torch, choosing to die so that the man who doubted Dutch the most can try to build something honest on the edge of a world that no longer wants outlaws. And then, on that mountain, Dutch lets go of even the illusion of family. He listens to Arthur's last accusations, hears Micah's snarling defenses, and does nothing. When it is over, he simply walks away into the snow, neither saving nor condemning. The camera, the story, the very question of who Dutch Van Der Linde really was lingers over his fading silhouette. Did the man from the very beginning ever truly exist? Or was he only ever the echo now disappearing into the cold? In Red Dead Redemption, that fading silhouette reappears on the edge of a cliff in the far north, and the echo has become a man. Older, thinner, wrapped in a heavy coat and heavier delusions, Dutch Van Der Linde faces John Marston not as a father, but as a problem to be solved. The world was changing, and Dutch had not changed with it. Or perhaps he had changed too much. The Dutch John hunts in 1911 is a ghost trailing the memory of the man from the very beginning. He still speaks of freedom, of government tyranny, of civilization choking the soul of the frontier, but the fire is gone from his eyes. The rhetoric is the same, the cadence is the same, yet even he seems unconvinced. Where once he robbed trains to strike at corporate power and corrupt officials, now he hides behind terrified native followers, using their desperation as a shield. The living embodiment of his own worst fear, he has become the kind of exploiter he once swore to resist. For John, riding after him is not just a government contract, it is the final chapter in a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family forged in violence and shattered by pride. This is the boy Dutch once pulled from the mud, the lost soul he taught to read, to shoot, to believe that the gang was family in the truest sense. It was Dutch who promised John that together they would stand outside the system, that no government, no railroad, no oil baron would ever own them. Now that same government holds John's wife and son hostage and sends him to put a bullet in the man who once called him son. How could that not twist the knife in every conversation they share? Dutch's early ideals echo bitterly through the world that follows. His warnings about encroaching government power become real in the Bureau's blackmail of John, in Edgar Ross's smug certainty that the state can do no wrong. His hatred of corporations is mirrored in oil derricks scarring Great Plains, in the railroads that carve up the land he once rode free. His dream of a chosen family becomes a cautionary tale, as John tries to build a quiet ranch life with Abigail and Jack, haunted by the knowledge that the old ways were dying and that the past never truly lets go. There is a cruel symmetry in how Dutch's story ends. He spends his life trying to live outside the system that took his father in war, yet in the end he is dragged back in as a tool, a justification, a headline that lets the Bureau claim the frontier is finally tamed. Then, just like that, he is discarded. One more outlaw corpse on a cold rock face, paving the way for Ross's next promotion. Seen through the lens of who he was before it all fell apart, every later scene with Dutch changes. His final words to John on that cliff, that they are both just ghosts, cease to be the ramblings of a madman and become the summation of a philosophy that failed. The story of Dutch Van Der Linde is not simply a villain's descent, it is a mirror held up to John, to the gang, to the closing frontier itself. And as Dutch steps backward into the void, the question lingers, If this is what happens to the man who tried to fight the tide, what hope is there for the ones who simply go along with it? In that lingering question lies the heart of Dutch's power. Because Dutch Van Der Linde is not just a man in this story of outlaws and lawmen. He is the living embodiment of a national fantasy. Charismatic, educated, fiercely independent, he walks through the crumbling West as the self-made rebel hero America promised itself from the very beginning. He steals, but calls it justice. He runs, but calls it freedom. From its humble beginnings, the gang exists as a stage for that myth. Dutch takes in lost souls, gives them names, purpose, a code. Rob from the rich, spare the innocent, stand against government and capital. John and Arthur are not merely trained as gunmen. They are taught to read, to quote books, to see themselves as more than common criminals. In the truest sense, Dutch builds a family around an idea that a small band of outlaws can resist an entire civilization and remain righteous. Yet the same story that elevates him also hides the shadows beneath his philosophy. Every ideal carries an exception, every rule a convenient loophole. No unnecessary blood, Dutch says, until anger makes it necessary. No harming innocence, he insists, while deciding who counts as innocent. Freedom for the gang often means terror for the towns they ride through. Their dreams of liberation are paid for by frightened clerks, wounded guards, and grieving families left in their wake. This is where the American myth turns. Ideals become excuses. Principles become armor for ego. Dutch's hatred of government and industry begins as a response to real injustice, but slowly his rhetoric becomes a shield that deflects all criticism. If the plan fails, the problem is betrayal, not the plan. If people die, the fault lies with civilization, never with the man who ordered the dynamite placed on the tracks. As the world was changing, that contradiction only sharpened. The frontier closed, railroads cut through valleys, Pinkertons carried the law into places it had never reached. The old ways were dying, not just for outlaws, but for ranchers, small farmers, and anyone crushed between capital and the state. Dutch stands against both. Yet his gang robs trains, banks, and stagecoaches that carry the wages and savings of those same ordinary people. Resistance and predation ride in the same saddle. So was Dutch ever truly good, or only good at telling a story others needed to hear? Hosea, Arthur, John, even Sadie all fall in love with a vision that never fully existed outside his speeches by the campfire. Perhaps that is his greatest crime, not simply the bodies left behind, but the faith he exploits, the loyalty he twists, the way he turns genuine hope into a weapon. Loving Dutch as a character means sitting with that discomfort. He is inspiring and unforgivable, noble and selfish, a father and a destroyer, much like the country that made him. And as the tale moves toward its end, that uneasy mirror will only grow harder to ignore. That is the discomfort that gives this entire saga its power. Because the tale of Dutch Van Der Linde is not just a story of a villain undone by pride, but of a father figure who once made broken people feel whole. From its humble beginnings, this was a campfire story whispered in the dark, a wounded boy who lost his father to a war he never chose, growing into a man determined that no one under his protection would ever bow to government or civilization again. From that childhood wound came a philosophy: freedom above obedience, family above law, thought above blind tradition. When Dutch met Hosea, two con men each trying to rob the other, the moment was almost comic. Two predators, one table, one purse. Yet from that irony grew a partnership that felt, in the truest sense, unbreakable. Dutch dreamed, Hosea doubted. And together they built a gang that was meant to be the living embodiment of resistance in a world that was changing too fast. Arthur arrived as a lost soul, angry and half-feral, and Dutch did not just hand him a gun. He handed him books, words, a way to see the world. Hosea taught him how to track, how to lie, how to survive winter. Dutch taught him how to ask why. Later, John Marston followed the same path, another stray-turned student, another boy taught to read and to believe he was more than a common outlaw. This was not a band of thugs. It was a rough, wandering schoolhouse built around a fire. In those golden years, the gang robbed trains and coaches under a code that mattered. Rich men, corrupt outfits, railroads that carved through homesteads as the old ways were dying. Dutch pulled people out of gunfire, risked himself first, preached that no innocent should suffer for their dreams of freedom. The camp laughed, sang, and believed. It felt, For a time, righteous, yet the cracks were there from the very beginning. Dutch's hatred of the state curdled easily into hatred of anyone who represented it. His speeches about loyalty left no room for dissent. Every successful heist confirmed his genius. Every setback was someone else's betrayal. Was this idealism or the earliest shadow of delusion? Seeing that full arc changes everything. Dutch's teacher, philosopher, and father casts a long shadow over both Red Dead Redemption games. Arthur's stubborn loyalty, John's bitterness, Dutch's soaring speeches in Coulter, Saint Denis, and Beaver Hollow all become chapters in one long, coherent tragedy, not scattered moments of madness. So the question becomes unavoidable. At what point did a flawed idealist become an irredeemable tyrant? Was it Blackwater, Hosea's death, the moment he left Arthur on that hill, or some quieter compromise years earlier around an unremarkable fire? The final choice rests with the listener, and that choice will shape how the ending of this story lands when the last gunshot echoes and the dream finally dies. So the question has been laid bare in the firelight. At what point did the man who preached freedom become the tyrant who burned everything for his own reflection? That is not just a question about Dutch. It is a question about belief, about loyalty, about how far a person can travel from the very beginning without ever admitting they are lost. For some, the turning point will always be that ferry in Blackwater, where an idealistic dream met the cold machinery of civilization and never truly recovered. Others will point to the first compromise, those early robberies where Dutch's code bent just enough to make room for cruelty, when the story of robbing the rich began to blur into simple greed. Was the man already gone then, hidden behind a philosophy polished enough to dazzle a camp full of lost souls? There will be those who swear it happened when he left John behind in the snow, when family became expendable and survival became an excuse. Others will circle Hosea's death in Saint Denis as the moment the soul of the gang bled out on a city street, leaving only a hollow prophet raging against a world that refused to listen. And for many, the final betrayals at Beaver Hollow, the abandonment of Arthur on that ridge, will stand as the point of no return, the instant where the mask finally slipped and never came back. Beneath all of those moments lies a deeper debate that refuses to die. Was Dutch ever truly the man Arthur believed in, the living embodiment of resistance and rough-hewn honor? Or was Arthur, and every believer huddled around that fire, only ever seeing the side Dutch wanted them to see, a carefully crafted legend built from its humble beginnings to hide the rot beneath? In the truest sense, was this a story of a good man broken by a changing world? Or a dangerous man finally revealed when the old ways were dying and there was no frontier left to hide in? For those drawn to this kind of slow unraveling, to character-driven lore where every choice leaves a scar, this campfire does not have to go dark. More tales wait in the embers: Hosea's untold story as the quiet conscience of the gang, Arthur's moral evolution from trusted enforcer to haunted witness, John's reluctant march from outlaw son to government gun, pressed into a future he never asked for. Each path bends the light differently, revealing new angles on the same broken dream. So let this be an open circle. Let every listener claim the moment Dutch changed, defend it, challenge it, and argue what it means for the gang's legacy. As long as voices keep returning to these questions, the story of Dutch Van Der Linde and his family of outlaws does not end on a cliff or in a grave. The fire still burns, the shadows still move, and the world that made them lingers on in the glow.